This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Feral Historian, a YouTube channel run by Matt Pearson. We'll be talking about him, the channel, and what he aims to accomplish with it. Feral Historian is a rather new channel, under a year. I think it's been 11 months since the first video was uploaded by Matt Pearson, who runs it. And I say Feral Historian because in looking him up, I know there is the definitive article, Feral Historian, an Asian fellow who travels around the globe. So welcome, Matt. Can you tell a little bit of background about yourself? Are you a teacher? Are you a historian? And where did you come up with the idea for Feral Historian, etc.?
Well, first off, I was not aware that there was another feral historian, but that explains why I couldn't get the Twitter handle. So clears that up. So my academic background is in history. And I was kind of on that path until, for a multitude of reasons, I dropped out of graduate school during a PhD program. So, the feral works on multiple levels. It's went off the reservation as well as do most of my stuff wandering around in the woods. But I kind of drifted from doing straight up historical research, primarily late World War II, early Cold War kind of stuff, and started thinking more in terms of what is the cultural significance of that? What's the impact? And once I started thinking about it in those terms, it became very clear throughout the film and television of, particularly in science fiction, starting kind of late 60s, but really through the 70s and 80s, because that was that first generation that you had that grew up in the post-war period and started writing and producing TV and movies, that you really have the impact of that period, which I've always found really interesting. So that's mostly what I ramble about on my YouTube channel. And let's see. As for what my goals are with the channel, that's because, like you said, it was been about a year. I think it was last April that I put up the first video on a whim, really. And it's been kind of an experiment to see if people are interested in this stuff, if it builds up an audience. It looks like it's starting to get some traction now, which is interesting. And I think, this is the point where I really start thinking about what am I actually trying to do with this? Because it started out just like, okay, I'm going to go and make these short little videos talking about stuff that I think is cool. And now that some people are also thinking, oh yeah, this is some interesting stuff, I have to really examine what the approach here is going to be. And I think what I'm really trying to do with it going forward is kind of getting people thinking more about like the mythological foundation of some of our pop culture, starting, late 20th century stuff into today, and where it comes from, and then how it affects kind of the mindset that we have looking at the world around us. Because it really does. Like, I was raised on G.I. Joe cartoons and Star Wars, which kind of warps my view when I'm talking to people much younger than myself who don't know, like, to them Star Wars is something that had Jar Jar Binks in it, and they don't know what I'm talking about. Like, they've seen it, but it's not foundational.
Just a couple of points of the things you mentioned. I had seen one of your videos earlier today when I was just looking at it again. You had mentioned about, I think it was Star Trek doesn't deal with PTSD, and then you mentioned World War II. And I'm writing a World War, I started a novel to write World War II. I write very quickly and I write a lot. But as I was doing it, I was saying, I don't want to do another James Jones. I don't want to do things like that. And so it quickly became in my mind a novel about the 40 years after the war and these people, a few dozen people, and how they reacted to the war. Because I had a job about 17 years ago where I had to call World War II veterans and I'd hear their stories, because we were trying to sell these books before Facebook, where you could groups could get together, and these people wanted to talk, and I'm thinking, my God, what a vast resource there is. I think there is a website, though, now that has been taken down for the last 10, 15 years, the stories of people who in World War II before they passed from this earth. And um, I do also, one of the things, and I want to, why I contacted you was uh, your little 8 to 12 minute videos, I think, are far better than a lot of the rambling YouTube kind of videos you have, because you're walking, you're sitting, but you also have this sort of monologue going on, and you have this little sly humor, and it's something different. Too often you get these YouTube videos where it's mostly leftist critiques where they're not really criticizing anything. It's just an explanation of what they feel something's about. Whereas listening to you, you are bringing, and you strike me as someone who's probably would be in the libertarian camp, as someone who's actually saying something. Whether people agree with you or not, you're actually fucking saying something. And so where did you get the concept for the walking videos? And do you memorize your monologues, or does it just come to you?
Usually, well, the first couple that I did were kind of off the cuff. So yeah, the one on the economic system in Fallout 4, Boss Capital,
Yeah.
and there was one I did on the V series from the 80s. Yeah. Those were just kind of off the cuff, and they get a little bit rambly. So since then, usually I have an outline, just kind of the major points I want to go with. Occasionally I script sections of them out when I want to make sure that I say something correctly. But usually what'll happen is I'll write the thing out, think, okay, this is good. And then I'll print off the outline the day of when I'm going to head out there to shoot the thing, scratch a couple things off, think, okay, this doesn't really need to be said. I'll shoot it, I'll get back, I'll be editing it and be like, this doesn't need to be said, and I'll cut it down. And by the time I'm done with that, I've usually stripped about a quarter of it out. So that's part of why they're so short, because I'm just trying to keep it like, okay, I've got a point to make, I'm going to make it and get out. Nobody wants to sit here and watch me ramble on for 45 minutes about some particular point of an old TV series from the early 90s. So...
Yeah, well, I think it works well. And one of the things that my website, E-Cosmoetica, back when I started it 20 years ago, it was pre-blog. So it became popular, but it had nothing to do with what I was saying, or I was saying something qualitatively. Because in 2014, when I started this YouTube channel, the deliteracy, I call it, of America had increased even more. And people, when they want to watch videos, I mean, even your 8 to 12 minutes is pushing the attention span of a lot of people. But at least you're not one of these, earnest YouTube people like, when Bergman talked about this, blah, blah, it really, and they have this sort of faux, I'm an intellectual kind of voice. And I think you have the possibility within the next couple of years of, getting to the, 50,000 views level. I don't, because I'm not as focused as you are, and that's something that I do these just to show that people in the early 21st century could talk intelligently. But I think you've got something there, and as you refine it, it's gonna be really good. So let's talk a little bit then about why the science fiction rather than say being you said World War II, rather than say doing videos on famous battles, why did Barbarossa fail and this kind of thing.
I think the main thing is that there is a lot of stuff out there already about the straight up history of it. And whenever I've tried, even back in university when I would be writing stuff about military history specifically, I found that I wasn't as interested as I thought I would be in getting into the details of why this battle failed and why this particular, political initiative within Nazi Germany didn't work out the way they expected and what were the implications of that. I was far more interested in how this affected people. What were the individual stories and perspectives throughout this? And while I read a lot of primary source material of, a lot of war memoirs, things like that, I find it doesn't really crystallize until it kind of gets filtered through the popular culture. It's kind of that mythologizing process where I think that's kind of how our culture deals with war, because we don't have the rites of passage that some other less technologically advanced cultures would have. It's just like, okay, you go over there, you do this thing, you come back, and now you've got to kind of forget about it and get back to your normal job, you know? And it's not, we don't really have a mechanism for the individuals to kind of separate that out. So we have to do it in this big public cultural sort of way. And I really think that a lot of, particularly the post-World War II science fiction, you see it a little bit in pre-war stuff, but really that first generation afterwards kind of gets the fully developed, processing of the aftermath of that, where, I talk about the space Nazi trope a lot in 70s and 80s sci-fi. It's like that's one aspect of it, but it just kind of continues on, like, Aliens being a Vietnam movie rather than a science fiction film. That's another thing that I've harped on from time to time. But
so let's talk about the sci-fi aspect. I mean, were you a sci-fi nerd going back? Did you read classic sci-fi like Frankenstein through Jack London? A lot of people don't even know Jack London wrote a lot of sci-fi. Olaf Stapledon, or were you mostly from Foundation and the big three on?
I'm mostly probably post Foundation. It's I really got into it when I was a little kid with original series Star Trek and Star Wars, the really big stuff that everybody was kind of aware of. And then I started reading some Asimov, a little bit of Arthur C. Clarke, a lot of the classics. I went through the obligatory Heinlein phase, which was interesting. And a little bit of pre-war stuff. I've read a lot of the some Olaf Stapleton, a lot of the just recently I was reading through all of the 1930s Buck Rogers serial comics, which were kind of enlightening. I mean, I was aware of what was in there, but I hadn't actually gone through them.
People don't even realize Armageddon 2419 was a novel, then became the comics, then became the serials.
Yeah, it's just like vastly changing with each iteration of it, which I mean, that was an interesting thing in itself. Armageddon 2419 was very much this kind of post-Great War kind of story, and with American guerrillas running around the woods fighting the Hans and their airships and disintegrator rays and stuff, and then they turn that into this comic, which keeps some of the elements of it, but that's really where that kind of 1930s Flash Gordon style ships with fins and all this stuff comes from. I always kind of wanted to see a straight adaptation of Armageddon 2419. I think that would be a really interesting film. I don't think anyone will ever do it, but.
So did you watch any, like, when I was a kid on PBS used to have serials. They'd have Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, the Phantom Menace or something like that.
Yeah, I don't remember most of the titles.
There was one, an Undersea Kingdom.
They all kind of blur together. Not too long ago, I watched the first 3 series of the Flash Gordon serials and the first couple of the Buck Rogers ones, but anything that I saw prior to that, all the Commando Cody and all that stuff, it just kind of blurs together into this, early sci-fi mass that I can't really pull things out of without going back to.
Yeah. Well, let's talk then about Star Wars, since I think I have 1 or 2 about Star Wars, and that's the most direct homage. And I have to say, when I first saw Star Wars, I was born in '65. I saw it, I remember, with my friends on the 1-year anniversary of being released in '78. And I remember thinking, because I had watched on public television in New York all of the Buster Crabbe stuff, not only Gordon and Rogers, but a few of the other things that would come on early Sunday mornings. It was just the shit they threw up there. And I always found Star Wars lacking. Not that I'm a Star Trek, great Star Trek fan or fan of a particular series, but I always found the first 3 films and the first one, I always thought, yeah, but I remember that was in episode 12 of this, and they were doing it, and for the time the effects were more updated, but I always found it to be a kind of hollow exercise, with the one exception of them bringing in the Joseph Campbell monomyth trope. And I actually did a show about a year ago where I had a lot of people and myself. I think Joseph Campbell was one of the great frauds of the last century. what is your take on Star Wars? I know you did one on fiat currency, I think it was, with
Oh,
Star
right.
Wars. Um, do you see that more as a popcorn approach to science fiction versus, not that Star Trek is hard, but
Yeah. Kind of, the way I'm looking at it, I think, is that Star Wars is kind of the latest iteration of that same framework that gave us first Buck Rogers and then Flash Gordon, and then I mean, originally George Lucas wanted to make Flash Gordon, but there was a lot of problems getting the rights, so he made Star Wars. So it's going, it can't help being in that same tradition, but condensed down because he's trying to tell a complete story in a single film instead of spreading it across a long serial. So, I mean, really, I've always kind of thought of Star Wars as sort of the gateway nerddom, where like you can be pretty normal and get Star Wars references and that's fine, but that's kind of the way that a lot of people in my generation kind of went into the more involved, deeper layers of science fiction. But,
I know that you wrote. I think it's in. It might be right. I think it's in maybe your little intro for the channel. You talk about stories, and you reference going back to the early stuff. I guess I would assume back to Gilgamesh or earlier. But with the story, one of the things I've always found about all genres, including science fiction, is that there's far too much attention paid to the genre confines and not enough to character. And I think you've mentioned this on a couple of the episodes, and you've got about 24 videos up. You put one up, I think, yesterday.
yeah, I think it was yesterday.
I've always said that character is plot. No one gives a flying fuck about the white whale. They want to know
Yeah.
about the guys on the Pequod and why they are doing things. Do you think that, because I would say most, whether we're talking fiction published, fiction on television, fiction in TV, even things like what is it, the tall boogeyman they have now, the tall white character that was invented online, and now he's become a meme. Slender Man.
Yeah.
Slender Man. Do you think that character is one of the biggest things, the development of human characters in fiction in general, but science fiction particularly, is a problem?
Oh, definitely. There's, in fact, my wife and I were talking about this morning how a lot of the science fiction books that we read as kids, when you go back and look at them now, the character development is remarkably thin. It's just like, oh, I thought this was way better than it actually is at the time. And I think that's really one of the problems with, one of the many problems with the more recent iterations of Star Trek, is that they don't really have characters. Yeah. They have these placeholders for ideological constructs, and they're just there to send a message to you. And it's like, this person is there to represent this. They don't really have characters like the old series did, like really well-written science fiction books did. That said, though, I think there are a few rare cases where you can have a story where the idea carries it, even if the characterization isn't great. And what I'm really thinking of as a good example of this is, I think it's Peter Watts, the book Blind Sight, which most of the characterization in that, I thought, it was adequate but not great. But one of the underlying themes of the story is the idea that most people, and it gets revealed toward the end how accurate this is, that a growing number of people aren't actually conscious beings. Yeah. They're like automatons that are just going through their lives. I think the line he used was going through their lives pretending to give a shit.
Yeah, and it's the term is called a philosophical zombie in philosophy.
Yeah, yes, precisely. And it's like, I thought ideas like that can be interesting enough that you can get a book, or I suppose in some cases a film, out of, with mediocre character development, and it works. But generally speaking, if your characters are bad, it doesn't matter how interesting your plot is or how well developed your world is. It's boring.
Yeah, well, I know, for me, the king of that is Philip K. Dick. I think he was the ultimate gag. I mean, he would come up with a great idea, so-and-so society, this character does this, that. But then at the end, I got to a point, when a few years back, wrote a sci-fi novel, I found just in Googling, a public domain story of Dick that was horrible. The big reveal was that a character went back in time, and it turned out he had sent himself back in time to keep the timeline in order. And this was 1958 or 57 when this short story was published. And it's like, I rewrote the story and fleshed out the character and put it in my book, and then had a computer that ran the spaceship, saying, oh, they missed it, that this character was a historical character because no one had ever, I think I had it that no one had ever read the story of Dick's. But when we talk about science fiction, especially in television, and this is one of the areas I haven't seen a video from you yet, is what is your take on, for example, going back to anthology series? I'm thinking of Outer Limits, Twilight Zone, One Step Beyond, Tales of Tomorrow, if you go back to the early 50s. To me, it seems anthologies have been utterly lost, and it almost, I would use a term like pushing the limits of franchisability here, because if you look at the 3 or 4 iterations of Twilight Zone since Serling died, they're missing it. I mean, Serling, even though he could get preachy, he still had an undergirding that the modern stuff doesn't. So what is your take on sci-fi as anthology?
Yeah, I've always liked the idea of anthology series, but that's, again, probably because I grew up watching Twilight Zone reruns. But it's one of those things, I'm not sure that modern Hollywood really understands how to do it. Everything now is so built up on this idea of the seasonal arc, which can do some great things. I mean, I really think that the good stuff is happening in television for really the last decade, more so than film, because you can tell longer form stories like that. But it comes at a lot of times the expense of character development, because if you're going to tell a story, like you're going to do like a half-hour Twilight Zone episode or something, that takes a lot of skill to be able to create complete characters that you can actually empathize with and tell a narrative that makes sense within that narrow confines. When you have long-form, multi-episode television like now, I think you can get away with being really sloppy writing it, because, I mean, as we see with a lot of stuff, particularly, New Trek again, the writers can just kind of rely on, well, I'm going to directly tell you something and then move on to something that contradicts it, and just kind of trust that you're going to hang with it and that the character will flesh itself out over the run of the series, which rarely happens. You can't get away with that in short form. It has to be very condensed. It has to be very concise. You can't waste time on lines. You can't waste time on political messaging. You have to really know the story you're trying to tell.
Yeah, I think one of the problems with serialized storylines being the rage is that they fall into the trap of being melodramas like soap operas. And I've watched soap operas for years. I think melodrama is a valid form, but it can be done well or done poorly. When I look at all of these, fancy, highly lauded shows of the last 20 years, whether it's The Sopranos or Breaking Bad or Mad Men, they're just soap operas, and I don't find the characters particularly realistic. Mad Men, I watched the first 3 years. It was a good, solid soap opera. It's ostensibly to reflect the 60s, but all the characters suffer from diseases, infidelities. I mean, it's a soap opera, no more or no less than Melrose Place was. Season 4 and Season 5, it got to the point after 5 seasons, they're like, I'm not watching this goddamn soap opera the last 2 seasons. And yet it's praised. The Sopranos, the greatest show of all time. No, it's Mad Men. It was even greater. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying, I saw this stuff 45 years ago on daytime television.
Yeah, that's the thing. I've abandoned pretty much every show recently that's run more than 3 seasons for similar reasons. Like a lot of people will praise the Expanse series, which in a lot of ways I really like it. I like that idea of a relatively near future science fiction, but it did suffer from that. It was like, okay, you're not so much telling a story as you are setting up the next setup for the next setup. Yeah. And by the time the series ended, what was it, after 4 seasons? I can't remember exactly, but
I think
it's
it was
like
6
okay,
I read, but
yeah, maybe. But they all kind of blurred together because of that. So
and didn't that show end with them having a 2001 sort of trope, and that they encountered aliens that were even greater. And so
Yeah.
you get all this human setup or whatnot. You know, one of the things, rightly or wrongly, with the Foundation is it's a human galaxy,
Yeah.
maybe, and so you're still dealing with humanity. And then you get something like this, and there's always some big bad that ends
Yeah.
up coming, the Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah. It's I mean, I try to figure out which point I want to address first. I'll keep with the Expanse here. The thing that kind of bothered me about that, I read the first book in that series. I didn't pick up any of the other ones after that for a multitude of reasons. The main one being that I like that idea of the near-term human future, but of course they have to introduce, there's the alien virus that's creating all these things, and it undercuts everything that it seemed like they were trying to do, which is unfortunate. But I also kind of find it interesting with stories like Foundation, as you say, or Dune is another great example, where you have these vast human civilizations, and there's nobody else out there.
Yeah.
No remnants of lost civilizations or anything. That always kind of gets me thinking. I spend a lot of time sitting around kind of pondering the implications of that, and what would be a good way to tell a story of a large human civilization that encounters an alien civilization, but it's something that's so alien that, you know, it's not like Star Trek where it's humans with funny bumps on their heads, but it's not like some of the other stories that try to make it so alien that you can't understand it. Well, it's like, okay, well then how do we talk about it? It has to be like...
Well, it's like Lem's Solaris Ocean or Hoyle's Black Cloud. I think one of the problems, obviously, makeup and effects from 60 years ago for Star Trek or Doctor Who are going to be what they're going to be. But yeah, you have that thing where you have either it's so abstruse that like people who end at 2001. I think 2001 is one of the 2 or 3 greatest films of all time. But it's either that or it's the other way, and it's just Klingons, or people with the pointy ears kind of thing. I wanted to ask you, because one of the things that I haven't seen yet, you touch, is the whole Planet of the Apes phenomenon. And now I've read the original book. I don't know if you have, Pia Bull.
Long time ago, yeah.
Yeah. It's a terrific sci-fi book. It came out, I think, the same year or a year after Solaris by Lem. And you had the '68 film, and then the 4 films that got progressively worse, and then the new film. And one of the things that I people send me stuff to watch all the time, and I like this Picard season of Star Trek. I piece together things, and I'm not going to watch the damn thing, doddering old Jean-Luc. But when I've seen the new Planet of the Apes franchise, I think of the Uncanny Valley, and these apes to me are inherently less scary than the apes of '68 were back in '68, for a particular reason, is they're too realistic looking. When you look at, there's some of the Planet of the Apes DVDs for the '68 one, you see tests that were done with Heston and a few other actors, and they don't look quite ape-like. But the apes with the rubber mask look close enough to human that they're off. You can't really, are they fully ape, or are they an ape-human hybrid? And I think one of the reasons when I watched that, and I'm not just looking back in the glow of my youth, is that there is that uncanny valley thing with the makeup of Zaius and Zira and Cornelius there that gives an idea that something is askew here. And I was just wondering, what is your take on the whole Planet of the Apes thing in general?
Yeah, it's been a long time since I've watched any of those, even the new ones.
Well,
I mean,
go ahead.
I mean, yeah, I was just going to say that, I mean, part of the thing with CG in general is that, like doing long-form television, it gives you a lot more tools that you can play with, but it also makes it easier to get sloppy. And so with the old Planet of the Apes films, I really do appreciate, having done some makeup work myself in a film capacity, just how difficult it is to get a prosthetic onto somebody and have them deliver a decent performance over the course of several hours underneath this big hot mass of latex glued onto their face. So, I mean, I give Planet of the Apes a lot of credit from a technical standpoint for that. I never really thought about the Uncanny Valley aspect of it that you mentioned, but now that you do mention it, I would have to agree that yes, definitely, it's much more interesting watching that film than it is watching the new one with the computer-generated apes sitting around having their ape conversations.
Let's talk about Star Trek for a bit. I want to touch on some of your videos and whatnot, but I want to also touch on political stuff. I want to also get the Star Trek stuff out of the way. One of the words that I detest in the last 20 years is world building. It gets back to what I said about character. It's like, I don't give a fuck about how realistic your blinking lights are if there aren't characters. And I even go to the other extreme. I'd say, when I think of the original Star Trek with the salt and pepper shakers with just the thing on it, that actually looks more futuristic to me, because if you look at technology gets smaller and more banal looking the more powerful it is. If you remember cell phones from the late 80s and 90s, they were these huge things with antennas, and it's like you're on Guadalcanal. Now you just have it in your palm. You don't even have to flip open like the thing. So when I see, like, especially something like Star Trek with the gadgetry and the stuff before the original show looks, that people say looks more futuristic. No, I say in the year 3000 or whatever, when the Discovery went to the year 3000, it's going to look more like goddamn Forbidden Planet, just a flying saucer. The warp nacelles, whatever they call it, they're going to be the size of pea shooters, at some point, and be able to go 10 times faster. So let's talk about technology and sci-fi, and then head over to Star Trek. What's your take on what I just said about the science of the science fiction here?
One thing that I've noticed the last 15, 20 years maybe with consumer technology is that in some ways it's kind of been bucking that trend, where the tendency of things to become simpler with cleaner lines, easier to use, starts to reverse with, well, for example, I had no trouble with my first car with the manual radio, and you just flip the knobs. And my wife's car, I don't know how the hell to turn the thing on. It's just like there's buttons and switches, and they're all labeled with abbreviations, and everything's done through a digital display. I don't know. I give up. It's very much that Star Trek syndrome thing where it's just like we have to make it look more advanced at the expense of usability. It's a similar thing with cell phones. It's like those old ones, even the flip phones from 20 years ago were not that difficult to use. It's just like, okay, this is a phone. I recognize this. If I pick up a new iPhone now, I'm like, okay, well, I got to mess with this for a little bit to figure out how to do anything with it.
But realistically, we're talking cell phones now are really like 20 things. They would have been 20 separate devices 20 years ago, too. So we've smushed 20 separate devices into one little thing.
Well, that's true. I mean, I guess I always a bit curmudgeonly in the way that I like to keep all my devices separate too, because I don't want to have that many points of failure on everything.
So here's my take on Star Trek, even going back to the original series, and I think a few people have mentioned this before, but I think Star Trek, the Federation, I guess, is the worst type of dystopia that there is, because they do not realize they are dystopia. Think about their culture. It is stagnated. When they do we ever hear the equivalent of the Beatles or the Led Zeppelin of the 24th century? Do we ever hear the equivalent of a Bach or a Rachmaninoff? Do we ever see who's the biggest film stars? Is there, Galaxy Tonight TV show about the latest, Vulcan superstar who betted her film or her whatever media buddy? I mean, this is a culture that is stuck. The science is stuck. It as further iterations have gone on, it's basically the United States hubris put into the Federation of Planets, and yet the people themselves are narcotized. They like whatever the thing of the cell phone, or they're addicted to the holodecks or whatever that are real cheap, or
Mhm.
it. And so I think instead of the utopia that Roddenberry was going for, we have probably the most sinister kind of dystopia because no one thinks it's a dystopia. This isn't like what you said about the Drakas or the Empire.
Mhm.
They're just fat and sassy, and it's a wreck. So what's
Yeah.
your take?
Well, I wrote an essay many years ago that was arguing that Star Trek's United Federation of Planets and the Galactic Empire in Star Wars are actually the same entity described by different people. Because in both cases, you do have this massive interstellar state that is culturally stagnant, largely technologically stagnant, is highly militarized. Star Trek does a slightly better job of hiding it, but it's like, oh, you want to go explore the galaxy? What do? Well, you got to join Starfleet. Well, what's Starfleet? Well, it's the Navy.
Yeah.
And it's not even that. It's just that it's not only military personnel. You have Starfleet botanists and Starfleet biologists, and people have their families on the ships, which kind of implies that that environment's not that unusual.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I would definitely agree that there are some greatly overlooked dystopian aspects to Star Trek, and I think there's a future video in the works kind of addressing that and kind of an oblique angle. But
Well, I saw a video yesterday, or maybe 2 or 3 days ago, where someone did a video, and it was, how do people in the Star Trek universe go to the bathroom? Do they literally have the sensors go in and pull out the shit and the urine from the blood? I'm thinking, boy, that's a real way to make someone weak. Imagine how
yeah,
degenerated the sphincters of your average Federation person is. They can't even shit.
yeah, you don't want people to be incapable of surviving under natural conditions.
Yeah.
That doesn't end well.
But the look of the show, especially these last few years, the live action shows, I should
Mhm.
say, the cartoons still have that light, almost 60s looking, full of colors. But I was watching the Picard, a few videos of the last episode. I guess it's episode 7, and I'm like got eye strain. I mean,
Yeah,
I'm like, why the fuck is it so dark? I remember the Next Generation. It was bright and light, everything. This idea that dark is depth. I mean, I've always said, I am so tired of that trope. The heroes are the people, the good guys are the people who have it harder because it's very easy to be bad. You just
yeah,
let things go. Let things go. But if you look at the great ideas, or rather the great heroes, I mentioned Gilgamesh or Beowulf or Sir Gawain from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. These are the putative heroes. You could argue they were more anti-heroes on the fence, but these are characters that break that monomyth mold. These are characters that have depth and complexity, and yet now you're only complex if you're dark. Why do you
yeah.
think that is, culturally speaking?
I would attribute some of it to just the shallowness of our current cultural state. Um, like I'm trying to think of a really good villain over the last 5 or 6 years. I'm having a hard time coming up with one. I'm sure there's something, but so often it's just, we'll show that the bad guy's bad because he'll kill somebody and it'll be dark, and we'll show that the good guys are troubled because it's dark and they're brooding.
Yeah.
And I like, no, you got to give me something else here. But I had a train of thought here with this, but
Yeah.
okay, got
Well,
to switch glasses here to catch it again.
well, when it comes to just the pipe
Yeah.
up, this is one of the reasons too that if you wanted to call me a fan, I can only say I'm a fan of the Kirk series,
Mhm.
because for all of its faults, those characters seemed less degenerated in the way I was saying than these modern iterations, even if they're set beforehand. And it's not any of this stuff like you can have black characters and female characters and lesbian characters, trans characters, whatever characters. But at least if I was if I think of which Star Trek captain I would want to serve on, it'd have to be Kirk. Uh, uh, Picard strikes me as a bit of a fey dilettante even before he was old. Cisco seems to be a psychotic mess. Captain Janeway, is probably one of the most evil captains there is. And Jonathan Archer, that was such a terrible show. I tuned out after the first season. So when you look at these shows over this however many 10, 12 series iterations there are, do you see that this is a show that's basically just milking the cow, for the money?
In a lot of ways, particularly recently, I think the last few Trek series, Picard and Discovery, don't really like. Alex Kurtzman, the showrunner, doesn't get Trek. I mean, clearly he's watched some Trek, but he doesn't really understand what it is. That became very clear in the first season of Picard, if Discovery hadn't already showed it to us. Just like when J.J. Abrams made those movies, it's like they're like very well produced Trek fan films, but they're not Star Trek.
Yeah.
But kind of going back to the earlier stuff, I think that there is kind of an interesting progression. I've always kind of thought of it in terms of the original series with Kirk's crew. That's a very young, expansionist, vibrant Federation. It's kind of like the Chuck Yeager days of it, where it's you can just throw this guy in a rocket plane and he'll go break the sound barrier, and it's like, all right. And with Next Gen, Picard kind of represents that more. The Federation has become a stable superpower kind of a thing, where of course he's going to be more refined, he's going to be more of a diplomat, he's going to hedge his language a little more and not be quite as hot-headed in difficult situations. And then with Enterprise, which the first 2 seasons of it were not good. The 3rd season was good on its own merits, even though it completely broke Trek continuity. And by 4, they were kind of starting to get their footing. But I always kind of thought Archer was interesting from the standpoint of this is the first ship they're sending out. The captain is being chosen largely as a political appointee. So who is this character? Well, he's the son of one of the main engineers that designed the warp drive. He's got that going for him. He's politically acceptable to Starfleet Command. He's politically acceptable to the Vulcans. This very realpolitik compromise kind of choice. So I was watching the series from that standpoint, which may have gave it a little more depth to my mind than was actually there, because a lot of those first 2 seasons episodes were not good on their own merits.
I remember as a kid in the early 70s seeing the cartoon version of Star Trek, and I thought that was actually pretty good for the era. I mean, the animation was shit, but the stories themselves were, a lot of them were unused from the original Kirk show. When I talk about the 3 main shows before the modern age, you're talking Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager, putting aside Enterprise, which we just mentioned. I've always thought, for some reason, Deep Space Nine gets a lot of huzzas. And I actually interviewed the guy who played Damar on there in an actor interview. And I thought that show had the best secondary cast, but I thought they had the worst mainline cast. And I actually thought Voyager, which is roundly beaten up, had better overall actors. And so after the first show with Kirk and Spock, that's actually the show I think is the best. I don't really have favorites or whatnot, but I thought that Kate Mulgrew, the guy, B'Elanna Torres, who was the Doctor, 7 of 9, that these characters were interesting. Yes, they had a lot of tropes with they're kicking the shit out of the Borg, they're one ship. But which of those shows would you say was the best? If you want to include the first show, how would you sort of rank them as shows? Do you see a steady decline or up and down?
Yeah, it's interesting because over the course of the last few years, I actually watched everything from Next Gen all the way through to the end of Voyager, which got me through about 4 moves. So they're relatively fresh in mind. And it's Really, I think the way I would rank them would have to have some qualifiers in every sense, where Next Gen I kind of think of as sort of like baseline modern Trek, where it's like I was saying earlier, the Federation is settled now. It's out of its frontier phase. It had a lot of episodes that were not good, but overall, I thought the series was pretty solid. Voyager, I remember the first time I watched it, not thinking it was very good. I think I was focusing on the elements that I didn't like about it. That like Janeway having that holodeck program where she's, playing the fantasy of a governess, and it was like, oh, come on, what is this? And, negotiating with everybody at the expense of getting her own crew home. It's like, okay, you're more like a Democrat senator than a military captain. Like, what are you doing? But watching the show a second time all the way through, it made a much better impression than it did the first time. I'm not quite sure why. I think it may have been that some of those characters were actually much better than I kind of gave them credit for. Chakotay was one that I really liked. I gained new appreciation for Tom Paris. I ended up not thinking too highly of B'Elanna, though, because they kind of did that thing where the shorthand for her being Klingon and having a temper would just be that she's surly all the time.
Yeah.
And it was like, I don't know, she's acting like, I don't know, I taught high school in Detroit for a few years, and her performance was very familiar for that environment. It was like, okay, just sit down and chill. But Deep Space Nine, in some ways, might be my favorite Trek, in part because it's Star Trek that Gene Roddenberry never would have done.
Yeah.
It addressed some things that Trek, under his watch, always stayed away from. It's DS9 was the only one that really got into, like, in even a very basic sort of way, what is the effect of being involved in an interstellar conflict on the individuals that are actually on the front line of it. There was the storyline with Nog that I thought did that particularly well, considering it was, early 90s television.
Well, I love the Cardassians. They're sort of these Shakespearean Nazis, they're not just space Nazis. They're space Shakespearean Nazis. And that brings me when I said how I thought the main cast though was the worst. When I think of Avery Brooks, and I remember him from Spencer for Hire, and his character is basically the same kind of character as on Star Trek. He's just one of those actors that has a very limited range. Yeah. But to me, he was the worst of both Kirk and Picard, is that he had these literary pretensions of Picard, but he had the kind of thing with Kirk. And just watching some of there's what it's called, like In the Pale Moon, the Pale Moonlight is considered by many of the fans one of the best episodes. But every time he comes on screen, he's just blustering, and I just find as a captain, he's just annoying. He's like I said, the worst of Kirk and Picard. What is your take on Brooks as an actor? Just off the top of my head.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would agree that I haven't seen his entire body of work, but what I have seen has been pretty much in that range, which he does that range well. It's just a question of whether that was the optimal choice for a Starfleet captain. That's always been one of Trek's problems, is that it's not necessarily problems exactly. It's depending on what they're going for, but that it's never really been believable as a military outfit. But I mean, overall, my impression of Sisko has been good, but there have definitely been moments throughout the series where it was kind of like, really? You're going to do that? Maybe tone this down a little bit, think it through. He's kind of, maybe my defining negative Sisko moment was in the Emissary, that first episode of DS9, where he gets the assignment and he kind of whines to Picard about not wanting it. Yeah. And then at the end of the episode, he's kind of come around and he's decided, okay, I actually do want this job. And it took me probably 3/4 of the first season to kind of get over that, because it was this like, hey, you signed up, it's your job, that's the posting, do it.
Yeah. So I want to touch on some of the political themes that you touch on in the videos, and then talk about some of the individual videos. But the final thing I wanted to say on some of the sci-fi aspects is I hope at some point you do a show on Forbidden Planet, or a video on Forbidden Planet and the Krell, because I saw this video recently about the interface of the brain and this thing that several people, including Musk, are developing, and I think back to that device where they increased the Krell mind and released the id, and this is something that I've never heard talk about in AI circles. And I don't know, you're probably far more well read than I am, science fiction wise. Has there ever been any story that deals with that brain AI kind of interface where the monster of the id comes out? As in Forbidden Planet, because I think that's before Star Trek and before 2001, that was the gold standard of space opera.
Yeah, I'm not thinking of any other stories that really dealt with that specifically. I know I've done some reading, some technical papers dealing with like direct computer brain interface stuff, because I try to keep up on those kind of things. But yeah, I'm not really sure if, I mean, being that the id is kind of a psychologist construct anyway, I'm not really sure that if there would be any way to actually translate that into something that would manifest in physical space, even if you had the hardware that could somehow do it. I think maybe the problem with, the thing that scares the hell out of me with any kind of a direct brain interface is that it would by necessity work both ways.
Yeah.
And once you do that, then you no longer have any basis for judging what your own thoughts are, because you can implant stuff just as easily as you can use your brain signals to control machines, and that's troubling. That would be kind of my red line. It's like, you put a little helmet on that lets you move a robot over there, okay, fine. But once something's implanted and directly hooked up, it's like, no go.
And what happens, when you get a computer that freezes up, and now you're interfacing with it? Does your brain freeze up? Are you just there,
Yeah.
that philosophical zombie? It's one of those things. I personally am not. If you ask me my top 1,000 worries of the human condition on this planet, the, what do they call it, the robopocalypse, or the AI takeover, is in the 800s. I can think of literally hundreds of things that are far more scary to me than that, because I just see how bad computers are now in dealing with them. Now, yeah, of course they'll get better. In 200-300 years, we might have to worry about that. But by that time, I think the merger is going to happen between, and there will probably be natural people, there'll be cyborgs, and then there will be these androids that are the third constituent there. But anyway, so I had mentioned earlier that you had struck me as being a libertarian leaning in terms of politics, and I would consider myself a progressive libertarian. But one of the problems I have with the sort of duality, or what I would call the triad of American political thought, being, say, liberalism, conservatism, and libertarianism, is that not a single one of those three follows their principles. The liberals, you can't be a liberal if you're for political correctness. You can't be a conservative if all you're doing is being concerned about people's sex lives, whether they want abortions or whether they're gay sex lives or what. And if you're a libertarian, you're supposed to be a civil libertarian. The civil shouldn't be silent. You shouldn't be a corporate shill. So what is your take on the modern state of politics? And then we'll go and work our way back to fiction. Yeah.
Well, in short, it's a god-awful mess. But developing on that, I think really the axis to be looking at is more authoritarian versus anti-authoritarian. That's really that kind of breaks the political divide that most people are kind of trapped into, or establishment versus anti-establishment, if you prefer. I think in a lot of ways, I go beyond libertarian. I mean, I'm almost an anarchist because it's like, should the government? No, because everything it ever does leads to mass pain somewhere. Even if some good comes out of it over here, there's always a vast damage over there. So I'm extremely reluctant to support any kind of state organization or anything where, one group of people has power over any other group of people, because it always seems to end in the same place. But of course, it's very like, how do you get there from here with any kind of a functioning technological society? I don't know. So in practical terms, it has to be more like, that's where I kind of fall into the libertarian side, where it's, okay, you want to do this. It's going to require some coercion of somebody. Justify it. You actually have to make the argument, and you're going to have to convince people. That's one of the things that's gotten lost in today's politics. It's like every faction is just kind of, it's become so tribal that nobody has to actually prove their point anymore, I guess is where I'm going with it.
See, I don't like necessarily the idea of big government, but the term necessary evil comes up to mind, because you're going to either have an out and about government, a big government, or you're going to have a shadow government run by corporations. And I grew up in a very Goodfellas-like area, and when I was working since the age of 6, doing little errands here or there, so off the books. And then I spent the last 40 years in corporate America, and the corporations are worse than the mob. Yes, they may not kill you and leave you in underneath Giants Stadium like Jimmy Hoffa or wherever he's buried, but you want to look in what is the town in Michigan with the water still is fucked up.
Flint,
all of this stuff. So it's one of those things like, are we going to choose Mussolini or Hitler? It's
yeah. Well, I think like 2 points with that. One of them being that a corporation, it's a legal fiction. It's artificial personhood for legal and tax.
But it is a legal person. 1819.
But it's a creation of government. If you don't have governments to endorse corporations, then what you have are people owning stuff, which they can then be held accountable for it. It's like, if you actually own the business, then you have skin in the game. It's not like now where you can have a CEO of a bank borrow a bunch of money, make a whole bunch of bad investments, bail on it, get his $30 million payoff, and then let the shareholders deal with it. But the other side of it is, I don't think you can have any kind of a real libertarian, voluntarist, whatever kind of society you want to call it, structure without a cultural change where people become just inherently skeptical of anybody claiming authority. Because I'm not so much of the position that nobody should ever be in charge of anything, because of course that's ridiculous. But I do think that as a society, we could benefit greatly if every time somebody stood up and started giving orders, if the natural inclination for the average human being was to say, okay, who are you? Why am I being told to do this by this person? What do they get out of it? And just kind of, like break it down from the standpoint of skepticism, instead of kind of the baseline now where it's, if somebody seems like they're in authority or is granted some authority, then people are inclined to follow it. I mean, I moved out to the Black Hills here a little over a year ago, and mainly because I was living on the West Coast during the whole COVID nonsense. And I was just baffled at how people would respond to that the governor just says, okay, you've got to wear a mask when you're walking in the park. And people would do it. What the hell are you talking about? You go to walk into a grocery store and they want to count how many people are already inside. You go to the pub and they want to check your papers to see if you're vaccinated. And like, what the hell is this? But I'm looking around and everybody around me is just going along with it. Like, well, that's what they told me to do. I mean, I thought it was absolutely insane. I had to get out of there. It was a madhouse.
Well, let's talk then about voters, because people will always talk about the politicians, but I, for example, have voted third party for most of my adult life. I made the mistake of voting for Obama twice, and my criticism of him isn't that he's a far leftist. I think he's just a more safe version of the corporatist mouthpiece
Yeah,
that we've
exactly.
had elsewhere. But voters, they're not rushing to get ranked choice voting, because that's the only way you're going to get a third party viable. And I don't mean third party like Ross Perot or the communists or the socialists, whatnot. Although I have voted for socialists here and there. I have I live in Texas, and on the local level, a lot of the the dog catcher, you don't have to give your party affiliation, but. I put it on people. I get sick and tired when people say, "Well, you're just throwing away your vote." I say, "Well, let's see. For the last 40 years, the Democrats have held down the body of America, and the Republicans have raped it. To me, they're both guilty. Maybe one is a little bit more guilty than the other. Okay, I'm fine. But what's going to change? If you're not even willing to educate yourself and vote outside the box, or enact policies or changes in the voting system, you can't. I despise Donald Trump. I grew up in New York. Everyone knew he was a fraud. His father, getting back to the mafia, people worried about the Nazis. I said his father made billions with the mafia. These are people who literally killed people. And you look at him, he's got the mindset of a mob boss. But I'm not a big fan of Biden. Biden, the last 40 years, was one of the major people responsible for the corporatization. Let the money flow. So what is your take on the average American voter? Because for me, the wisdom of the common man has been proven over and over again to be bullshit, especially online and in voting.
Yeah, well, it goes back to that Enlightenment idea of, if you have an educated citizen class, then they will make the best decisions for the greatest number. Yeah. Well, no, because people don't actually think that way. People make decisions primarily based on emotional factors, which is why this terrible propaganda from both sides works. Like, on the one hand, you'll have a favorite thing for the Republicans is to trot out we have to ban abortions because a heartbeat, it's a life. Okay, well, fine, but in practical terms, how do we actually translate that into viable policy? Because you can't just say we're going to send women to prison for abortion, because that's absurd. And, just like the last couple days now, we've had the Democrats trotting out the typical old thing of, no, the guns are killing the kids, so we've got to ban the things. Okay, so you cast your magic spell that you call a law that says these things can't be owned anymore. How does that actually change anything? Because you've cast all these other little magic law spells that don't fix anything. It's like nobody's really focusing on, okay, what are the actual causes of any of these issues? Like, people don't have abortions because they just want to kill their babies. There's usually some economic factor, some social factor. There's something going on there that's spurring that. So we have to address things on a much deeper level. And as an electorate, not only from poor education and poor information and lack of civic virtue kind of way, but just the way that the human brain works, we're not very well equipped to make those kind of decisions. And also, I wanted to just make a quick little point about, I don't like the ranked choice voting ideas, because generally the devil's in the details on those. And you end up like the case in Alaska during the midterms there, where because of the way things are tabulated, and if people don't mark their preferences down the entire ballot, then the ballot gets tossed out, and little counting irregularities like that, little ways you can play with it, you end up with the candidate that got the third most votes winning the election. If you're going to do it, it would be much more practical, I think, to have 2-round voting, where it's like, okay, all the candidates go in, you vote for whichever one you want, and then the top 2 are in the next round, and now you can actually make an educated decision based on what you end up with.
But that's presuming people can make educated decisions.
Well, yeah,
and are we going to have a national holiday for a week? Because how many people literally are going to go out twice to vote in a week? So, I mean, all of them have issues, but it's interesting because I've told many people who are liberals, and they'll talk about certain aspects of modern candidates, and I said, something, if you look at Richard Nixon when he ran for president in 1969, he's to the left of Biden by a wide margin. If you look at the Republican, go back to Ike, 1956 Republican platform. That's fucking what the socialists today are saying. So you know, there's a popular meme online that shows like the Republicans always move things to the right, and the Democrats are the thing that holds the wheel from going back to the left. What do you think is the cause of this rightward drift, where we go from Republicans who under Dwight Eisenhower are far to the left now of the modern Democratic Party, to where we basically have, if not outright fascist, a para-fascist Republicans and a far-right Democrats, and there's no one on the left. Yet it's always the comment. What, even if there were communists here, what would they even stand a chance? They wouldn't get elected dog catcher.
Yeah, there are communists. I spent plenty of time on a university campus. They're around. But I'm not sure that I accept the premise.
No?
Part of it is that, like, in certain areas, there's probably been a rightward shift. In others, there's definitely been more of a leftward shift, I would think. But I think really what it comes down to is back to that, you know, establishment versus anti-establishment sort of axis, where everything has moved more towards some sort of centralizing power, some sort of control, whether it be direct through government regulation or through corporations working together with government, varying ways of limiting the social and economic freedoms of the average person and transferring wealth into this. They're not exactly a ruling class. It's more like managerial class, so like the army of functionaries that make up the, you know, political. Yes. Although I usually use apparatchiks more in the, like, the next level down, the ones that are going out enforcing things and nagging at you about stuff and reporting you when you don't comply with the silly rules. But you have this, you know, corporate and government lifer class that just kind of, they're there to run these entities and to siphon the wealth out of the working people and make sure that nobody gets too far out of line. And that's really the problem. And it transcends, you know, right and left. It transcends party. It's just a natural outcome of when you have a long-running, you know, permanent governing class of, you know, whether we're talking actual government or the corporate entities that are increasingly indistinguishable.
So let me pick up on a couple of things that you had mentioned, Matt. First off, when we're talking about sort of the political spectrum, I think you'd used a term like that or something to that effect earlier. I've often said to people, you know, the political spectrum isn't just a straight line. It's got a dimension. And if you go far enough to the left or far enough to the right, they become indistinguishable. And the reason I bring this up is, I was arguing with some communist Stalin genocide deniers who, they'll bet, the 40 or 60 million, he only killed 7 or 8 million. Let's say that's true.
Yeah.
What the,
how is that better?
Yeah, I mean, okay, there's less work for the Gravediggers Union there, but whether we're talking the Armenians with the Turks, whether we're talking Native Americans here in our own country, whether we're talking King Leopold and the Belgians, what they did in the Congo, whether we're talking obviously Hitler and the Nazis, whether we're talking Mao, who was worse, Stalin or Mao. Why do you think, I mean, it's on both left and right. Do you agree with my assessment that there's a third dimension?
Definitely.
If you could expound on some of these things.
Yeah, well, one of the illustrations I've always used for that is that, okay, so supposedly you have the Nazis are far right and the Soviet Union is far left. Okay, Nazi, abbreviation for National Socialist. Okay, fine, we know what that is. And then we look over to the Soviet Union under Stalin, where the revolution was initially this internationalist sort of thing that was supposed to export communist revolution throughout the industrialized world and lead to this global, new Soviet man living in brotherhood. But then Stalin comes along and that proves that it's not going to work. So he kind of restructures it into socialism in one country was the terminology he uses. I used to be able to say it in Russian, but not anymore. But okay, socialism in one country sounds a lot like National Socialism. And well, let's look at how they're functioning. Well, you have this militarized state run by a political party with an authoritarian ideology. You have a slave labor system. I don't know. I'm not seeing a whole hell of a lot of practical difference here. That's the burrito folding over.
Yeah. Let's see. I wrote here. Oh, yeah. One of the things that I've often argued with the people on the far left, and as I said, I'm uncomfortably in the middle, I guess. I mean, although when I was a kid, I did escort women into abortion clinics. So I do have a progressive leaning. But one of the things that I talk to about people who talk about socialism or communism is that I think at a fundamental level, the reason that communism failed is that it's not part of human nature. And then people will get upset. What are you talking about, human nature? Humans can do this or that. But on the whole, people have evolved to be selfish. This is what evolution does. It forces you to what is best for me, and the individual is not thinking about the long term. And communism, where everyone's going to share, well, no, we evolved. We're the monkey that's going to hide a banana every so often, so we have more bananas than the rest of the tribe or the troop, so that we can survive when the bigger, badder troop comes along to steal our stuff. And I think one of the things that happened with communism writ large into the world is that, number one, I don't think the leaders really believed what they were saying. Number one, as I've said, I think Ho Chi Minh could have been supported by the Girl Scouts and would have willingly called his people the Girl Scouts. But he wasn't a true blue communist, I don't believe. But when I think of things like the Stalin and the Mao's, I just don't think that kind of level of sharing is in human nature now. Maybe in 1,000 years, culturally, it might not be evolutionarily, but it might be culturally put in, hardwired. So what is your take on communism as a whole versus National Socialism or fascism or imperialism, feudalism, all of these isms?
Well, as far as communism, I think it can work in very small groups because in those settings, it can play off of, like, humans can be very unselfish. They can definitely work and sacrifice for the group, but the group has to be a family, or it has to be like the surrogate family of a group of close friends or a tribe. When you try to expand it up to an industrialized nation state with millions of people, there's no way that's going to work because of the anonymity. It's the same as why, like, the level of discourse on the internet is just like how it's fallen to the absolute lowest level of human interaction, in large part because of the anonymity factor. Like, people will say stuff to me in internet forums that they would never say if they were sitting across from me at a table, because all the human cues are, oh, if you're a person and you're right here and I'm looking at you, then you're real. Otherwise, you're not. And that's kind of the underlying.
Well, you're literally not a human. There's the mask. What do they call the mask effect? It's not a physical mask, but it's the mask of the internet and the anonymity.
Yeah, and that's kind of the problem when they try to do like large communist, any kind of collectivist government systems, is that, well, if I'm working in the factory, I'm working for myself, I'm working for my family, and I might be willing to put in a few extra hours to help my buddies here on the line, but you're telling me that I'm supposed to be doing this to help provide for people on the other side of the continent? I don't know those people. They don't mean anything to me. So of course I'm going to cut every corner I can if that's supposed to be my motivation. And the way that they would try to culturally get that across, particularly in the Soviet Union, they were famous for this, where they would have parades and they would issue awards for the socialist labor ribbons that people could hang on their desks and they can put in the big factory walls. As I've got one hanging on my desk in the basement. It's like, that's not going to motivate people. Nobody cares. They're not going to put in the extra shifts so they can get the ribbon there hanging saying how much they've done to help their fellow man somewhere else, people they've never met. That's, I think, the primary reason why that breaks down and why all the old Soviet propaganda of Homo Sovieticus, the new Soviet man is going to rise up from communism. No, he's not. He's not coming.
Oh, yeah, let's go to the opposite end, because I've worked in retail for about half of my adult life, and like I said, I grew up doing off the book stuff for crooked nosed people. And um, I when I hear people talk about capitalism and how efficient it is, I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Just I work in retail in a supermarket environment, and there are things called service contracts. This is why Coke and Pepsi get the lion's share of the displays and not the smaller sodas, or everything in a store. I mean, 40 years ago, if you went to a supermarket, you could talk to the local manager of a department. They could bring something in. Now everything is plotted out and paid for. Every fucking square inch is paid for. Well, that's got a name. That's called graft. It's called bribery. That
Yeah.
should be illegal. How is a small company with a better product than Coke or Pepsi or Kleenex going to get their stuff there? And so this is how you get all this humongous amount of waste in the industry, overproduction, things that sit on shelves because they have the companies can't afford to pay, or if they try to pay the assorted companies for shelf space, it goes bad. So what is your take? Because I've always said that there's never been such a thing as the free market. There are always hands pulling the strings.
Yeah.
Unless you got 6 people with 2 farms and they're doing a little farmers market, and even then there might be someone pulling the strings. How do you view capitalism and that what I would call essential corruption within it?
Yeah, well, I would say that, like, for the first point, I think the closest that the world has ever had to a true free market was probably in, like, the 1350s, in the aftermath of the Black Death,
Or the
where you
Hanseatic
have, yeah, everything just collapses, and now you have this huge labor shortage. So people are no longer bound to the land. It's like, if you want to leave and get a better job, getting paid more somewhere else, all you have to do is walk over there, because there's just not enough, and there's not enough people to enforce the edicts of the king on who's going to extract taxes from various trade routes. It's just, everything's opened up, and that's really one of the many factors that's often given for the fall of feudalism and the rise of capitalism, which is this whole other thing. But capitalism is one of those things that, when people talk about it, they usually, there's the textbook, economics theory version of it, and then there's the what we actually have in the world variant, which isn't really, strictly speaking, capitalist. You could call it, crony capitalism or corporatism, although I try to stay away from that term because a lot of people equate it with fascism due to some mistranslations. But kind of like, as you were describing, where you have that organized graft, where it's like, oh, well, this business is big enough that it can just buy up the shelf space almost in perpetuity. That kind of thing wouldn't actually exist in a truly capitalist, totally free market system, because you try to buy the shelf space at the grocery store, and they're like, well, you want the shelf space, you buy it now, but we're not going to sign this contract for, I don't know if people are going to keep buying this. I want to keep selling what people want. I don't know. Not whatever you're trying to give me. But let's see, I had another point I was going to make after that about collapse of feudalism, Black Death. What was my other? See.
Yeah. Don't worry about it.
I need more scotch to make this work.
I thought you were going to go off on the Hanseatic League, but one of the things too I wanted to talk that I think comes up in some of your videos, and we will get to them, is that you mentioned a number of times about how people will say one thing and it's not what they're really saying. And I think global warming as an idea has been really neutered. Now, I'm someone, I remember even the 1980s versus the 1960s, how things had gotten warmer in New York where I was, and I don't think anyone could deny that global warming is a man-made phenomenon scientifically, but feel free to make your argument if you do. But by calling it climate change, there's this neutering of the specific threat, because there are lots of climate changes over continents, over decades here and there. but global warming is the totality. And so by using a term like climate change, there's a definite diminishment of what people would call the problem or the threat, and it's like pushing it off down kicking the can down the road again. And this, to get back what I talk when I mentioned Joe Biden, is Biden to me is a classic can kicker. And someone like a Trump, even as idiotic as he did, I think he is, whenever there was an issue, he generally would try to address it. It might have been buffoonish and stupid, but at least, I don't know. What is your take on the idea of global warming and the usage of terms like that instead of, or terms like climate change rather than global warming?
Well, I think like the first point is that global warming relative to what? Because it's really a question of sample size. So it's like, on the one hand, obviously, when you have 7 billion monkeys burning things for decades, it's going to have an effect on the Earth's atmosphere. I mean, I don't think you can really argue otherwise. But the question then becomes, how much of that is, how stable is the Earth's climate absent that human activity? Because if we look at, whether it be the fossil record or Arctic ice core samples or things that give us some idea of what the climate was and what atmospheric composition was, we're in kind of a cooler period if we're looking in terms of, say, 100 million years or so. So it's really just a question of, okay, what do you accept as your baseline that you call normal? There's a much wider range that would be acceptable, that would be, if the world got, say, 5 degrees warmer on average, it would be terrible for some places, absolutely catastrophic, but it would be beneficial for other places. So it's like, it's really a game of saying, okay, this is what's normal, and this is what we're going to accept as our preferred optimal level, which would be fine if we could actually sit down and have a truly scientific, totally objective discussion about what that is. But unfortunately, we can't do that, not only because the data is very muddled, very cloudy, but also because it's no longer just about how do we stabilize climate. It's become like enmeshed with all these other political priorities. I always thought that the change to climate change had to do so that you could basically now point to any adverse weather event and say, oh, that's because we are not following the policy recommendations that we have put forward, which always seem to concentrate money and power in the hands of people that are pushing the policy. So I'm extremely skeptical whenever anybody's like, oh, we have to do this because climate change. I'm like, maybe, but I'm not going to take it on faith.
Well, I think for me, it's less where it's going to happen, although that there are certainly areas that are going to be more affected, but who the things are going to happen to. Because if you're a poor person living in Bangladesh or living on the Gulf Coast or living in South America, it's the people at the bottom end of the social ladder that are always going to bear the brunt of it. And, getting back to, we'll talk about the Draco videos you did there. There does seem to be, what is the term you use in the Janissaries or the warriors, the slave warriors? But there was a term I thought you had used in the video. It's slipping my mind at the moment. But it's always going to be throughout time the people on the bottom that are going to deal with the most shit. I wanted to talk about 20 years ago. I had written an essay thinking that when they had started looking for extrasolar planets, once we found an Earth-like planet, that within 100 years we'll have faster than light travel because money's going to pour in. But and this is getting back to the sci-fi stuff, but now I'm not so sure. As we're speaking, there's this idiotic trial with Gwyneth Paltrow crashing into another skier some years ago. And I think that we just live in an age that is so degraded intellectually and so run by money and the pop interest that if we did find a planet that was habitable for human habitation, whether or not there's a species there or not, it would be a big news for 24, 48 hours. Then people would shrug and say, oh, but what happened at the Gwyneth trial? I really don't think that people, if they were confronted by some of these things that you see in science fiction films about, first contact or whatnot, I don't think even Elon Musk could gather people to do anything.
Yeah, I think there's something to that. I've often kind of wondered if, all of the catastrophic predictions from various quarters about what the philosophical shock would be of making contact with an alien civilization. I'm like, I don't know. I think it'd be an interesting news cycle,
Yeah.
but beyond that, I'm not really sure. I'd like to be proven wrong. I really would.
Barring them coming with the phaser cannons and taking out the top 10 capitals or something, people are gonna be like, oh,
oh no,
you have 3 vaginas? Oh my god.
But yeah, it's there's a lot of factors there. Part of it is just the cultural dumbing down. I mean, but also I do kind of wonder how much of it is that when the Earth's economy is a closed system, it makes it much easier to control it and extract wealth out of it. Like, for example, the Ponzi schemes going on with the global banking system right now, where there's something like, $18 trillion worth of debt floating around in the system. And it's like, there isn't that much money in the world. There's not $18 trillion worth of stuff. It's like, how does that even happen? Well, it happens because you have a closed system where you can kind of create all this phantom money and pump it out there and use it to buy commodities to enrich people. But if you had relatively cheap space travel, launch capabilities and whatnot, and you had people going out and mining platinum group asteroids, or better still, flying off to other star systems and setting up settlements, you can't do that anymore because it kind of resets you back towards your economy has to be based on, at its most fundamental level, what are you physically capable of doing?
Well, that brings the opposite end of that would be the idea of, is there any profession that anyone can do that you can justify them getting 50,000 times more than, say, the lowest end professions? I just don't, you can talk about, is there even such a thing as wealth creation? It's just what do I value? If I don't value this, boom, the market drops, boom, it's gone. So, this is why, and we'll get to the fiat currency in a moment. Just 1 or 2 more things before we hit your videos there. Well, let's hit the videos. So I'm going to go from the earliest going forward. You did so yeah, it's interesting. You did your show on Star Trek, the first one, the first video about the mirror universe not being an alternate universe. And that's a very tired trope that something happens and the butterfly effect, and certainly you can argue that, but the idea there, I think the mirror universe is more or less I go back to the 1970s. There was a book that was quite famous this was the era of Bermuda Triangle books and stuff, where it was called the parallel universe, universe singular, so that there would only be 2 universes. What is your take on the trope of mirror universes or parallel universes? And isn't that pretty tired? Because when I think of like the original Kirk one, it was tired back in the 60s.
Yeah, it's usually, and I say this as an alternate history guy, and I make the distinction being that, if it's its own self-contained thing, it can be good because you get to explore all kinds of stuff. I generally don't like stories where people travel between, like they go to the other parallel universe and see all the stuff that's different. It's like, I generally don't like time travel stories for a similar sort of thing, where it's like, okay, yeah, fine, but it's not as interesting as you think it is.
Oops. Matt?
Okay, yeah, so I think Marvel would be probably the most recent case of the parallel universe stuff getting very, very tired. But in the Star Trek case, I thought it was interesting precisely because it's not, some parallel. It's just like this. I thought of it in terms of a sewer that kind of runs underneath our own reality, and it's kind of all the anger and the fears that people are feeling in the prime universe there are just kind of manifesting in this underlayer, and how you can. I've seen a whole bunch of videos of people talking about the continuity problems with the mirror universe, where between the different series, because you go into it in DS9, you go into it in Enterprise, and it's like, no, it's the continuity doesn't matter. It's completely irrelevant, because it's this underlying mental, like, sewer of the psyche thing that I kind of talked about in that video. How in the first one, set in the original series, the Federation is this very young, vibrant, expansionist, optimistic and proud society. And like kind of the dark corollary to that is this militarist, imperialistic, quasi-fascist sort of thing that's depicted in that episode. And then when you get to the mirror universe in Deep Space Nine, where the Federation is this big, stable superpower that has to do all these peacekeeping missions and kind of keep a lid on everything, and they've lost a lot of that youthful vibrancy from a civilizational standpoint. That, well, the mirror universe shows humanity being defeated and enslaved by the Klingons and the Cardassians. It's like, well, yeah, because that would be the thing that would be kind of the undercurrent in a stable, kind of tired civilization, this deep-seated fear that they're going to be supplanted and subjugated by some of the other powers that they are still able to keep at bay just because of their inertia and technological superiority. And I thought it was far more interesting that way than to think of it in terms of just it's the evil parallel universe where the Romans continued or the Nazis won or whatever the usual tropes are that people grab for that kind of stuff.
You mentioned the Marvel stuff, and that just brought a thought to me. I remember Star Trek did the original Star Trek. I just call it Star Trek, just like I call the original Star Wars, not Hope. But in the original Star Trek, there was that episode where the god Apollo appeared to them, but it turned out he was an alien. And that brings me to the Marvel stuff. I mean, I know Thor is supposed to be an alien who was worshipped as a god. That's how they justify it in universe there. But aside from being a tired trope, I've always said this idea that superheroes are the modern god, I don't buy that, because everyone knows that Siegel and Schuster created Superman. No one worships Superman. No one worships Batman. No one worships the Thor of the comics. And if to go back again to use Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh was the first, in that sense, superhero, if you want to talk about it. But he didn't do particularly well by the end of that tale, even with a few tablets missing. But what I just don't get. It's like people want to justify, I think, some of the failed tropes of these comic book characters gone into movies by saying they're godlike. And Watchmen is another good one, which I think is a very overrated comic book. But there, at least, you had a bit of a self-awareness in the original Watchmen, not the thing. So what is your take on the idea that people conflate modern superheroes with gods?
Now, I had a really interesting conversation about this several years ago with a guy I knew in graduate school who was doing his whole line of research was the cultural impact of comic books and how it reflects things, but also how it shapes things. I mean, it was odd, but an interesting line of study. I kind of wonder how that went for him. But we were having a conversation about that very thing of the superhero pantheons being the modern equivalents of, the gods of Olympus or whatnot. And one point I was kind of raising was that nobody worships nobody worships Superman as a god, but I kind of wonder if people actually literally worshipped Zeus as though he's actually this guy up on a mountain, or was it more of a cultural kind of trope that was used to explain certain things, like, well, oh, my crop didn't come in, lightning struck the field, well, Zeus is angry at you for something. I don't know. I mean, did they actually believe that these were real entities in the sense of, like, modern monotheistic religions in several ways kind of distort our perspective when we're looking at cultures that predated them. And I do kind of wonder how much these old, the Greek and the Norse the Egyptian pantheons, how much of that was religion in the sense that we think of it today, of people actually worshiping gods they believe really exist, and how much of it was using these images as kind of placeholders for natural forces and, you know, psychological concepts, so that you can talk about them in a way that makes more sense than, you know, trying to do it in cultures that don't have all the, you know, pseudoscientific jargon that ours does.
Well, clearly there are people in the fundamentalist wings of various religions that seemingly believe that God is angry at them. You know, you know, I just went sterile. God must not want my clan to go on, or what it might be. That would people from you know, 4,000, 5,000 years ago really be that much more advanced in their understanding of things? I mean, I'm not that I don't know if you know Julian Jaynes and the idea of the bicameral. I've had problems with that.
But doesn't quite work for me either.
Yeah, but I can't imagine that someone would be so sophisticated. I mean, I'm sure there's a handful out there, some philosopher, but your average Roman farmer would, you know, if that lightning struck, would he not be like, oh shit, I better get my act together?
Yeah, it's not necessarily sophistication so much as just looking at the world in more of a mythological framework. So it could be that, you know, you could still think you did something wrong and that caused this thing that happened to you, but it's not necessarily you said something that made Zeus angry and he personally, like as a corporeal being, threw a lightning bolt down to ruin your life. It's more of a, you know, actions have consequences, thoughts have consequences kind of thing, sort of a, like a mythological framework to just, you know, get your mind right and live decent, more than like God is personally mad at you, because why would he care?
So let's talk about, you did a 3-part series on the Draca, and so tell me what book that's from. What the setup seems to be that they're sort of second level Nazis, a step down, but then they sort of move into the vacuum when the equivalent of World War II is fought in that world. Because if you can't set it up and then talk about some of the major themes like fiat currency, and you also compare them to a lizard race from, I think, a Turtle Dove series.
Yeah, right. Yeah, the Draca videos I did are really the first one where the channel started to take off. It started, S.M. Sterling, he wrote a book in 1988 called Marching Through Georgia. It's a World War II story. And the premise of it is that initial conditions during the time of the American Revolution were just a little bit different. Some stuff going on, Britain fighting Norway and various things. And so that at the end of the American War for Independence, the loyalists that had, in our timeline, went to Canada, that was not really an option for them anymore because some of the Canadian territory fell to the new United States. But the British had defeated and taken control of the Amsterdam, or the, I'm using the wrong thing, the Cape Town colony. And so all the loyalists from America went there, and they set up the Dominion of Dracia, which was the new British South African colony. So it was basically, Britain took that over long before they actually did in our real history. And it kind of becomes this anti-America is the way that the author has described it. Says he's doing it as a way to kind of, it's a story where history went as badly as possible. So it's like everything that's bad in American history, the Draca take to an extreme. So it's a completely slave-based society. You have this very small citizen caste that
wasn't it sort of, if the Confederates had done what what Black Americans went to Liberia, didn't like, if the white Confederates went down to South Africa in that?
Yeah, that was one of in his backstory, part of the thing that after the colony was established, after the Civil War, the Confederates, a whole bunch of them emigrated there. And after the French Revolution, a bunch of the royalists went down there. So it's kind of this collection of, the Western world's losers that all kind of run off there and set up their slave-holding civilization. And it was really kind of an interesting story of illustrating just like holding up this dark mirror to our own history of like how bad things potentially could have gone in a lot of, had the worst excesses been allowed to continue instead of being snuffed out. And so the first book in the series picks up in 1942, I think it is, with a group of these Draca paratroopers who are, they go through military training starting at like age 6 or something as part of their schooling. So they're in ridiculous physical conditioning. And it's all about how this extremely disciplined, extremely focused, very pragmatically brutal society plows through the European powers during the Second World War, and they ally with the United States because the United States is very short-sighted about these kind of things, and they want to defeat the Nazis. And it's just this very interesting kind of askew version of the history of the Second World War that I found very interesting for not only literary reasons, but from a historical standpoint.
But one of the differences between, the Draca, from what I could tell from just Googling a few things and from watching your videos, would be very sympathetic to the Nazis, but they were just more upfront. They didn't have a Goebbels type of approach to doing things. They were like, look, we're going to fuck you up, and we'll wait 20, 30 years, but we're fucking you up.
You'd think so. That was kind of my first impression. It's like, why are these guys fighting? But then as I got a little further into it, it became really clear that the underlying ideological framework was very different, and where the Nazis were coming from this explicitly racialist kind of way, where it's like the German Aryans are the master race and they're destined to rule the world, and it's because of biology. That with the Draca, it was cultural, and it only seemed like it was racially motivated because they were starting out in Africa. They were trying to take over as much of Europe as they could so that they could enslave it. It wasn't going to be like, oh, the white Europeans get to be Draca citizens. It's like, no, you're all going under. And so it's this very different kind of, like, if you take, it was based more on, if you took the American style of plantation slavery, which in world history is kind of odd. Usually slavery isn't based on race. It's based on a lot of other factors, most of them economic, but some of them cultural and class. But if you took that American plantation-based system and you just expanded it to it's not just Africans now, it's everybody. That's kind of the basis of the entire Draca society. So it's a very troubling dystopia in a few ways, because when you really start reading through it and thinking about it, it's kind of like, oh, well, I could see how people could convince themselves of this, because there are shadows of it kind of rippling through the world anyway, and like have been for a long time, where it's people generally don't realize how widespread slavery is in the modern world. It's just very disturbing if you look at places like Dubai or a lot of the fishing industry out in the Far East. It's like, yeah, you really could actually have a very creepy functioning economic system based on these kind of ideas.
I just noticed that I don't recall if I watched probably all but 1 or 2 years. You have something called dark forest deterrence. What is that about? Because the dark forest is the idea that we should basically stay quiet so that the Borg don't come and assimilate us, basically. And yet, I myself just I look at that as a kind of very narrow approach to things. It's in my mind one of those things that seems to be misunderstood, because if it makes the presumption that there are roving aliens out there, that if they're out there, they are so far ahead of us that they're ants. And maybe they'd want to exterminate us like a giant anthill, but I can't see them enslaving us, or like the old Twilight Zone, making a recipe cookbook for us. It reminds me of two things: the so-called Fermi paradox, which isn't a paradox until you know that there's someone out there, which is misnamed, and then the Schrodinger's cat thing, which of course there aren't two cats out there waiting to fall into one. It's one or the other. We don't know. And Schrodinger made the goddamn thing up simply to show the absurdity of it. So what is that video about? Refresh my memory if I've seen it.
It's I'm kind of talking about the way that Xijin Liu talked about it in his Three-Body Problem series, where he gives a particularly dark take on it with the idea that as civilization, and I have no idea if he actually thinks this, I mean, this is just the way it's in his book, the idea that as civilizations become more advanced and they start to understand the real nature of the universe, one of the things they realize is that they can't effectively communicate with other civilizations around them before those civilizations would have an opportunity to destroy them, because there's so many ways that could happen. And so it's kind of this, Mexican standoff thing where nobody speaks the same language, and working through the raw logic of that in a game theory kind of way, coming to the conclusion that then the best course of action is to not be detected by any of these others, like the Dark Forest thing where you're walking through and you don't want the other hunters to find you. And if you do find one of these others, your only real option is to exterminate them. And I was kind of talking about the way he covers that in his book, and how, if you really break it down, it's not so much that civilizations as some inherent, it's not individuals that are coming to this conclusion, it's bureaucracies that are coming to this conclusion. And that everybody that's carrying out these dark forest strikes that are destroying civilizations that they now know are there, but are no apparent threat to them, are doing it because that's their job. There's this underlying layer in the whole story of 3 novels, where it's really a bunch of disgruntled functionaries just going about their jobs, destroying worlds in the process, which I thought was, extremely interesting, particularly given my field of study. But so I was just wanted to talk about that because nobody really addressed it. Yeah. Certainly not in the books themselves.
Was it? I think it was it Slaughterhouse 5 where planets were destroyed just to make way for a highway?
It was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Oh, it's Hitchhiker's. Okay. Oh.
Yeah.
I knew it was something similar. I want to talk a little bit about your video on Man in the High Castle. That's along with The Handmaid's Tale become one of the two sort of popular 60s tropes, or maybe it was Handmaid's Tale in the 70s, but decades old tropes that suddenly got, sort of movies or television series about them. I often thought as a kid growing up that if the U.S. was going to be split, it would have been split between maybe a Chinese and Islamic world. If Genghis Khan never existed, the Chinese would have explored more. There'd be no stopping the Muslims, and then we'd have a Muslim Europe and a Chinese, and we'd have, instead of having the Japanese and the German. It's an interesting idea, although certainly these alternate histories of what if the Nazis won, the Confederates won, whatever, is often done. Is the show, is that actually better than the book? Because as I remember 30 years or so ago when I read it, I found it to be a typical Dickian work, that it has a good idea, but the book itself, as it gets further on, it just sort of disintegrates. What was there? We mentioned Star Trek Voyager. It was the Voyager episode where the fake Voyager disintegrated or something. That's always to me when I read his stories. They start out with an interesting premise and then just fall apart. Is this better than the book, do you think?
Overall, of course, I was looking at it mostly from a cultural standpoint of the Nazi echo, that memory of the period. But purely from a narrative standpoint as a show, it's some of the characters are actually pretty good. I like Obergruppenführer Smith, Rufus Sewell's character gets pretty well fleshed out as the show goes on. He's interesting. He's this functionary that manages to rise higher and higher throughout the hierarchy and finds himself more trapped the more power he has. And of course, it's well acted, so it's worth a look just for that. Um, I found because it's basically two storylines. You have the East Coast Nazi occupied storyline, and then the West Coast Japanese occupied storyline. And overall, I found the West Coast parts of it to be much less interesting, less coherent. It's harder to craft that for a number of reasons. I think part of it just being the cultural impact. The fighting the Japanese has less of a direct cultural impact on us than the Nazis did for whatever reasons. But and of course it does some of that.
It's interesting. I mentioned I had a job years ago, and I can tell you that even those who served in Europe, the average soldier wanted to fight the Japanese first. They attacked us. You know, let the Europeans do their shit, and after we wipe the floor with the Japs, we'll come over there, and the Japanese, I should say, I was getting to 1940s. Then we'll come over and take out, you know, Hitler.
But, yeah, that's one of the aspects that I always thought was kind of weird about it. I mean, when you start digging into the historical archives, there's all sorts of weird stuff about why Roosevelt and Churchill in particular had kind of a hard-on for getting into the European war. And, you know, it's okay, I see some of it, and some of it's a little odd. But, yeah, it's peculiar to me how the echo of the Nazis had such an impact on American popular culture, like throughout the 70s and 80s, whereas it's less so with Japan. And I know some people would argue, well, what about the anime of the 80s? But it's like, that's post-war Japanese culture coming over. That's not like you're having these, you know, imperial Japanese villains. It's not like, you know, some caricature of Emperor Hirohito that's running the Galactic Empire. It's, you know, not like what happened with the Nazis.
But we did. I think one of the reasons is we kept Hirohito in power, and we shielded them. I mean, this isn't to say that. I mean, we basically shielded the Japanese war criminals from prosecution. I think Matsuhiro Watanabe, I think, just comes to mind as a name of a guy who was sort of the Mengele there in, what was it, Camp 31 or whatever it was. My wife had written about that.
There was a guy,
but
he was brought over.
Yeah, but with the Nazis, we just absorbed them. You know, Werner von Braun and all those guys that we took, because goddamn, we got those Reds over there, so let's get a few Nazis, because they've got a bigger heart on than we do against the commies.
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the aspects of my historical research that I'm actually in the process of trying to write a graphic novel based around all this stuff, because it's all the stuff that I did that would have been my doctoral dissertation if I hadn't dropped out of grad school. So I've got to do something with, you know, all those hours of labor collecting documents. But how it's generally thought of in terms of the United States going over there and hiring all these Nazis. Like, everybody knows about Paperclip and von Braun, but the similar thing was going on with the intelligence agencies and with some of the really shady stuff with chemical weapons programs and whatnot. And it wasn't just, okay, we're going to grab these guys, bring them over here and get everything we can out of them. It was, we're going to bring them over and essentially move them into lateral positions in our own institutions, which puts a whole new take on it. It's like you're not just getting the information that they have. Now you are integrating them into the institutional cultures of, you know, NASA and the CIA and all these various organizations, which it's more of a case of cultural diffusion than is generally acknowledged.
Yeah. It's interesting. I saw a video, maybe a month or so ago, about von Braun, and it was a year or two ago. I did a show about this aerial phenomenon that, you know, these little streaks going across stuff with some UFO enthusiasts and UFO debunkers, and it's interesting because it's clear that if you know anything about photography, I don't, but from people who have things online, that these are just photographic elements. If you have a triangular shaped aperture that closes, oh my God, we've got a triangular shaped UFO or whatnot. And von Braun was saying a lot of this stuff in this video that I saw about how the gullibility of the people, and this all gets back to the 1947 with the Roswell stuff, and when you see that, and you see, like I talked about, people not wanting to vote or what, how could the Nazis not have taken over Weimar Germany the way it was going? Because they were just as gullible
Mm.
for the little tricks to manipulate them. It, anyway, I'm just rambling, but it was just fascinating to see how easily these things play out again and again and again. And now we have idiots like that Marco Rubio and it's left and right wing acting, wasting how many millions to investigate this stuff, that if you just went down to a Nikon shop and got a guy
Yeah.
who's been taking photographs for 10 years, he could tell you what was wrong or right with what they're
Yeah.
assuming.
Yeah. Most of it is, I mean, occasionally there's some of those things like some of the stuff that the Navy has with gun camera footage from fighters that's also cross-referenced with radar stuff. It's like, okay, some of that's interesting, but all we have is the data that you've got there, and it's completely inconclusive. So, I mean, I guess pay attention just in case flying saucers show up, but I'm not going to get too worried about it. But yeah, most of this stuff I'll see people, they'll hold up, oh, I've got this footage of this thing, and it's like, yeah, that's your camera's not running fast enough to get a clear image. That's why it's streaking. No, it's so fast. No, it's really not. You're
Yeah, there was back in the late '90s. I've always had an interesting interest in what they call psi phenomenon and how people are so gullible. There were things they actually thought that insects that move too fast for the apertures 25 years ago, they call them rods and cones, and it's like no, but I mean it's just, well, anyway. One of the more interesting videos that I had no idea about that such a thing existed was, and speaking of alternate histories, is For All Mankind. And you seem to be as close as you've come to raving about anything in that video. And it seems, from what you said, that it's unlike, say, The Man in the High Castle, or unlike, say, the Draca. This has a far more plausibility. If you could just briefly talk about the enterprise that brought this this miniseries. Is it a miniseries or is it an actual series?
It's a series. It's it's 3 seasons so far. It's not perfect. It's definitely got a few flaws, but overall the premise of it is that they set up that the moon landing, that the Russians actually beat us there. And so that spurs the United States to try and up the ante a little bit. And it's like, okay, well, now we not only have to go to land on the moon, we have to build a base on the moon first. And it just leads to the premise of the show, this ongoing back and forth kind of thing. And it brings in a lot of the plans that NASA had during the late 60s and 70s for what was supposed to follow from Apollo. And it just kind of plays on like, okay, what if these things actually happened? And what would be not only the cool sci-fi aspect of it, it's like, oh, we've got a base on the moon and we're going to Mars, but also what are some of the social implications of these things kind of happening. I find the show really interesting from that standpoint, even though it does have some of those soap opera elements that we were talking about earlier. It's not perfect, but I generally do recommend it for a look for anyone that's interested in that kind of thing. And it's got some moments that are a little bit over the top, like some close quarters combat going on between American and Soviet forces on the moon. That's really interesting to watch, with the giant moon lander with some Marines on it flying in, playing Ride of the Valkyries as it swoops through the canyons to go land at the Russian mining site. I enjoy stuff like that, even though it's like, okay, yes, it's stretching it a little bit, but I'm going to run with it.
So its premise then is basically that had we not been the first on the moon, the Cold War space race would have just blown out of control. And from what you're saying, and from what I remember from the video, that's seen as a good thing. Does that give any pause or any comment about the paucity of space exploration that we've done? I mean, I think we've not gone more than 50 miles with a human being from the surface of the Earth in the 50 years since. What lessons does this show give?
Well, I think like what I was talking about with it is that as a kid that grew up like right after the end of Apollo, where it was still firmly in the cultural memory there, but the missions were over, and the space shuttle thing was just getting started, and it was supposed to be this, it was being billed as this space truck that you'll be able to launch every week and build space stations and build stuff to go to Mars, and it ended up just being this thing that you drive around the block endlessly. And so it always kind of felt like the future was supposed to be one thing, and then somehow we got a switcheroo pulled on us, and it's like, no, we're not actually going to do that. We're just going to orbit the Earth doing nothing. Which I'm sure, there are plenty of astronauts that have gone up on shuttle missions in the past half century that would say, oh no, we didn't do nothing, we did all these interesting things. And it's like, yes, fine, that's cool stuff, but we haven't actually gone anywhere. We haven't expanded the frontiers of human habitation. We haven't expanded industry in any way out into there, as a lot of these ideas that were floating around in the 50s, 60s, early 70s of what the future spacefaring society was going to look like. And this show kind of picks that up and gives us a glimpse based on those ideas, those assumptions almost.
One of the strangest videos that I saw in that you've done, at least strange given the context of the other stuff that you talked about, was your video on Cobra and the G.I. Joe thing. I recently saw something also on YouTube where this is how I found you, just seeing videos that played when I clicked on a video. I recently saw one about Thundercats and He-Man and which one was a better show and which one had and they went into a deep dive as if this was like a Dickens novel. And I was expecting the kind of same thing, but it was a more interesting take on the culture there. But I have to ask before you talk about that, you don't seem old enough to have grown. You seem not. I would probably say you're in your late 40s, maybe 50s or something. You would have been out of your age range for the G.I. Joes, at least the 80s, not the big plastic dolls of the 60s.
Yeah, well, G.I. Joe got started in '82, and I was born in '76, so that was just about right. So
it's your bicentennial baby.
Yep. So it was G.I. Joe was the thing until through into junior high there. And I mean, the toy line and the comics and stuff were still going strong by the time I was in high school, but of course it kind of aged out of it at that point. But kind of took a look back at it recently before I did that video to kind of see, okay, where did all this go? Because the Marvel comics that Larry Hama was writing ended sometime in mid-90s. I don't remember exactly when, but by that point it had just completely fallen apart, and it was like, I'm not even going to talk about this era of it because it's just terrible. Too many ninjas and whatnot.
Yeah, apparently the Cobra was not a terrorist group, at least in the iteration on television. It was more of sort of as if some kind of cult of personality. You could imagine I don't know if it's redundant, an evil Jerry Falwell or an evil Jimmy Swaggart suddenly was able to raise up an army of God to do things.
Yeah, this bizarre pseudo-occultish organization that seems to have, more military funding than the United States and the Soviet Union combined, and secret fortresses all over the place. And it's just like, it doesn't make any sense, but it was fun. But compared to the...
Go ahead.
Oh. Okay. I was just going to say that, I was talking mainly in the video about the comic storyline, which was a completely different version of it. Like Larry Hama did some interesting stuff with the characters and with the premise of it, whereas the cartoon was straight up geared toward kids, get them to be quiet for a half hour and maybe sell them some toys.
The final video I just want to mention is your Babylon 5 video. A few years ago, I interviewed Mira Furlan before she died. Really nice lady.
I have to find that one then.
You just Google Mira Furlan on my page, but it went about 2.5 hours. Really nice lady. But when Babylon 5 was on, I was living in Minnesota, and I couldn't get that, so I only saw Deep Space Nine. I mean, it went back and forth between some local stations, and so I was able to watch half a season here, half a season there. In a sense, from what I've always gotten from it, if we want to say, it seemed a bit more realistic than Deep Space Nine. I don't know really if it was, because Deep Space Nine had these godlike prophets, and then they had the evil prophets, the Paz race and whatnot. I don't remember. There was the Vorlons. There was it the Shadows, or was that a different one?
Yeah, that was
And
Beta 5.
yeah. So what was the point that you're making about these two, about this show, and where do you come down in comparing it with Babylon, not Babylon, with Deep Space Nine?
Yeah, it's like, overall, I would say that Babylon 5 is probably the better show. It's the production value is not as good, and so people, modern audiences, kind of ding it a lot for that because it looks very dated now. But overall, I think it was a better show. What I find most interesting about it is seeing it in terms of like a post-Cold War kind of story, because it was it premiered in 1993, if I'm remembering correctly, so just a couple of years after the Soviet Union collapsed, and we were seeing all the consequences of that. And Bab 5 kind of approaches that in a mythologized sort of way, where you have these two very old civilizations with a deep-seated ideological dispute between them, but they're so powerful that they don't dare get into direct combat with each other, because that'll just like wipe out all life in the galaxy, because they're essentially these godlike entities. So they're always getting these less advanced civilizations to fight little proxy wars for them, and we'll get these guys to attack these guys who are sided with them, and then we'll just kind of, and it was exactly what had been going on between the United States and the Soviet Union and South America and Africa, where it's just all these little proxy wars. And later on in the series, Babylon 5 gets into, because at the end of this conflict, these two powers are exposed for what they are, and the Shadows leave, and then the Vorlons leave, and so now it's these lesser powers that are left in the aftermath of the superpowers in the world that they had built, and they had defined things for so long, that now that they're gone, these lesser powers have to figure things out for themselves. But they also have this incredibly advanced technology left laying around that they don't really know how to use, and they don't know what to do with, and it's kind of dangerous for them to be throwing these things around. It was kind of like when the Soviet Union collapsed, all of a sudden Kazakhstan became the world's fourth largest nuclear power. Yeah. And it's like, okay, what are you guys going to do with these? And then you had to have all these negotiations with these breakaway Soviet republics to try and get them to give up these weapons. And famously, Ukraine agreed to surrender theirs in exchange for guarantees of security from the Western powers. And now they're kind of regretting that, but they're not entirely in the clear on that issue anyway. So plenty of blame to go around there.
So we were just talking a moment ago, and I wanted to mention that this has been a very good interview, and the reason is my wife was recently watching a Rod Serling set of interviews and lectures that he gave, and she was like, how the fuck did this guy 50 or 60 years ago, how is he so intelligent? You watch these modern TED Talks. Have you ever watched a fucking TED Talk? Especially the first few years, they were okay, but now such pseudoscience, such quackery, such and it's such navel-gazing shit. And here, 1962 or 1957, 1959, 1970, whether it's at UCLA or USC, or whether it's being interviewed by Mike Wallace, I mean, these people could fucking speak. They could talk and interview. So when I do these interviews, I'm harking back to that, and even if you ramble a little bit, this is who you are. This is what your interests are. This is not just about feral historian, but Matt Pearson. So I just want to put you at ease if you felt nervous, because I thought I did get you a little bit nervous earlier.
Oh, just a little bit. Yeah, it's the first time I've done one of these. So,
well, if the channel takes off, hopefully you'll do more. But one thing I will say about YouTube, it's very difficult to get someone who's on a more popular channel to do anything with you, because they're taking away my hits. And let's just for a second just deviate and talk about YouTube, because this is one of the things that I find very frustrating, is that if you get popular, you're boxed in.
Yeah.
And so like me, you probably average 500 to 1,500 views, which is probably about 3 times what I get. Although I do put them on my website, and I do get probably 2 or 3 times the amount of views there, but they don't count for YouTube because
Yeah.
they're off on another channel. But I'm never going to make money from this, and maybe you can if you grow it and stay focused.
Yeah.
But then
We
you
shall
want to
see.
not fall into the trap.
Yeah, definitely. That's one of the things I've been thinking about, because when I originally started the channel, it was kind of just because, well, I'm going to talk about something that I think is cool and put it up there. And I know a couple people that will want to see it. People that, friends of mine from places I moved away from, because I've moved around a lot the last few years. I was in Detroit for a while, and then I lived on the West Coast in Oregon for a while, and moved back to the center of the country. So not really in touch with a lot of people. So that was mainly why I started it. It's like, oh, you're going to ask me this thing about Fallout 4. Well, no, it actually does make sense if you think about this. And then started picking up more subscribers. So now I actually have to think about, or start thinking about, what am I actually trying to do with this? Because before it was just, I think this is cool, so I'm going to talk about it. And like, by far the most viewed video on the channel so far is that Cobra one you mentioned earlier, which is like, okay, cool, but I don't want to do a whole bunch of stuff on cartoons from the 80s.
Yeah.
So we'll kind of see how this goes. It's like, okay, why did people subscribe after watching this video? Let's see if everybody sticks around when I keep doing the kind of stuff that I've been doing, because I don't want to get too caught up in what the algorithm says works, because if it feels like work, I'm just going to stop doing it.
Yeah, well, I think my most popular video has like 35,000 hits, and there's maybe about 24 that are over 20,000. But I do these long interviews. I talk with young kids about art, and I break them down. And the most popular one is one where we're talking about pornography. And so, it's Dan Schneider on pornography in the modern society. So, well, of course, I want to see some tit, baby. No matter, it always comes down to that basic thing. But I wanted to ask you, how do you approach critique? And the reason this comes up is earlier today, as I was doing stuff, working on my book, preparing for the show here, I was listening again to YouTube stuff, and I don't know if you know anything about country music, but the old song by Glenn Campbell, Wichita Lineman, do you know that song?
I don't know that one, no.
Okay, well, it's his most famous song, probably, that or Rhinestone Cowboy. And it's got
everybody knows.
Yeah, it's basically about this telephone lineman talking about listening, being able to hopefully listen in on conversations that are buzzing through the wire, and his loneliness. And it's got a really fantastic couplet that goes, I need you more than want you, but I want you for all time. Not I want you all the time, but I want you for all time. So it's a nice little phrasing. But if you actually listen to the words, critically speaking, he's not... If you look online, they'll say, oh, this is about a lonely lineman talking about his lover, because one of the lines is, she's singing through the wires. Well, I hear you singing through the wires. And they assume it's a female. But if you look at the lyrics, it's much more existential of a song. It's a song about the loneliness of this one man on the outliers of society, worrying about snowstorm possibly coming. And when they talk about singing through the wires, he's on the outside, and he knows conversations are going through the wires. Now, I bring this up because, critically speaking, if you look at the crap on YouTube or whatnot, this is the level of criticism that you get about anything, whether it's the stuff that you deal with, whether it's this Glenn Campbell song. They go, it has to be the guy talking about missing his lover. God forbid that the character in the song, a Wichita telephone lineman, could actually have deeper thoughts. So how do you approach critiquing something? Do you look at the baseline idiocy of criticism about a particular topic and say, well, I've got to expand it this way, I've got to do it? How do you come about it to get that parallax that's uniquely Matt Pearson, feral historian?
Sometimes that's it. Like that was definitely one of the motivators when I did the video on the first season of Star Trek Discovery, because it was so many people have made videos just ragging on how awful it is, and oh, Michael Burnham's a terrible character, and this and that and that. And I'm like, okay, there are definitely some valid points here, but I think we can probably do a little bit better level of analysis to it and kind of critique things on a deeper level. So I kind of went the route of how does this, the missed opportunities of how this could have fit into the Trek timeline and really helped expand on some things that had already been established instead of just dumping on everything that had come before and giving us stories that don't make any sense. Because it's really easy to just grab something and say, well, this is crap because terrible dialogue and woke. But okay, fine, but that doesn't really, like, let's get into it a little bit more. Why is something bad? And also, I think a lot of stuff, even if things that I don't particularly like, a lot of times will have some element that I think is a good element and something worth kind of pulling out of it, something worth talking about. Like, I mean, that's kind of the thing with a lot of new Trek, where it's generally not good, but it's not all 100% unwatchable garbage. There are little threads that, if pulled out of there and woven together in something else, are actually really good. And I don't want to throw away stuff in its entirety when there's a few things that might be salvageable. And maybe talking about them will kind of, it would be my hope, down the line get people thinking, particularly if I can somehow get it in the heads of people that are writing these shows, like, oh, yeah, maybe we should have done that. Okay, maybe we can work something like that into what we're doing now instead of this dumb repetitive thing we've already done before.
Yeah, I think they do too many nods to old characters. Like apparently the last episode they had the Tuvok character from Voyager back. It's like, okay, let's bring back this character. Or a few ones before that they had the character Rolaren, which I thought was a well-acted, interesting character.
Yeah.
But it's not like the Return of the Messiah. She basically gets on there, gets angry, farts a little bit at Picard, and then is killed off. It's like, was that really worth all that build-up? Is that, just fan service,
Yeah. One of the things about this latest season of Picard, which I wasn't going to watch after season 2, which was not, because I have yet to find anything really redeeming that I want to pull out of that. But 3, overall, it's a vast improvement. But one of the things that really bothered me about it was when they get on the ship, what is it, the Titan, if I'm remembering right, Riker's old ship. And the helmsman is Geordi LaForge's daughter.
Yeah.
And it's like when they were originally writing Next Gen, Roddenberry specifically made it clear that they didn't want to have any characters that were like the kids of the original series cast, because it was supposed to be about, it's not about these individual people and their family ties and stuff. It's about human stories and about interacting with other people out in the galaxy and like, along with cool sci-fi stuff. But when they bring in LaForge's daughter as the helmsman, it's kind of like, well, now we're slipping into this dynasty stuff where everything just kind of condenses down into this very shallow little world, which sadly mirrors what's going on in Hollywood and in our politics today, where you have these like hereditary dynasties. Like, what's the best way to get into Hollywood in 1960? Well, it's to be a good writer or to be a good actor. What's the best way to get into Hollywood now? Well, have a dad who's already in the industry.
It reminds me of something. Now, you're too young to have seen the Brady Bunch when it was originally on, but I'm sure you know the Brady. Yeah, but I'm sure you've probably seen it, so you know that. Then a few years later, they did what was called, I think the show is The Brady Brides, where Jan and Marcia got married off, and it was a terrible, abysmal sitcom. Then about
I didn't even know that existed.
Yeah. Then about 10 years later, they did something called just The Bradys, and it's been roundly criticized as Brady something instead of 30 something, where it became a soap opera. And Greg Brady had I think they had like sons or daughters, and they were just like the parents. This iterations of Star Trek, especially this Picard, seemed like Picard something. It's like we have this doddering old idiot. I mean, and nothing against Patrick Stewart, and I'm not trying to be ageist, but he can't carry a show. I mean, he got number 1, and it's like, come on, for God's sakes. And then we're gonna get Data aged, and just don't bring him on the show. I mean, it just looks ridiculous. But I do want to ask you, just to get back to your political views and the idea of criticism. Um, there's a noxious notion that people say that all art is political, and I've railed against this for years or whatnot. You can have politics in art, certainly. You can have lots of things in art, but nothing is all political. Nothing is all whatever.
Yeah.
But I find that criticism of art, when it's highly politicized, I just learned this term a day or two ago watching a video debunking Ben Shapiro, and it's called the Gish Gallop, where when you argue with something, you tend to throw up a ton of shit that has nothing to do with the point you're arguing, just to make say, oh, you never heard of the Draco? You're an idiot, kind of thing. And I find right wingers do that. Left wing criticism do criticism for dummies. It's like, and so you have this kind of different types of smug elitism on either end. And I don't know which one is worse. But as I said, they never get to talk about the substance of the art. One of the things I've appreciated about watching these videos is you don't do the dummies, and you don't do the what they call it. I don't know if you know the term, the Gish Gallop.
I'm not familiar with that one.
Yeah, you
I'll
got
have
to
to
look
look
it
up
up
after this now.
Yeah, so has that always been your style of approaching life or art, or what? Is this something that you've come to in the last few years?
I think really what it is that when I was studying history in an academic setting, there is a lot of focus on archives. Everybody goes to the archives and tries to pull up the documents and tries to find new things in the archives that haven't been talked about before, because of course you have to do the new scholarship and write papers about things people aren't aware of and keep getting published. And I thought there was always too much focus on, I mean, nothing against archives, it's important. I get a lot of my stuff out of that. But it's too much focused on things that people wrote down with the intention of other people reading them. And I started thinking about, well, what do we learn from artifacts? Taking an almost, the term that I kind of half jokingly threw around was industrial anthropology, where it's like, I can find this piece of equipment, and what does this tell me about the people that made it and about the society that it was designed to be part of? And like the example I've talked about before is like, okay, what do we learn about the United States Army versus the Soviet Army by looking at the M16 and the AK-47? And when you start breaking down the machinery, you start to like understand the assumptions that go into them, and like both the engineering assumptions and the assumptions of use. And it starts to get this vague impression of the different doctrines. And I kind of approach media that same way, where like a movie is a cultural artifact. And so when I'm analyzing one, it's not so much, is this movie good? Are the characters well developed? Is it entertaining, and why? But, okay, I found this thing. What does this tell me about when it was made, who it was made for? It's kind of like digging up the 5,000-year-old piece of pottery and trying to discover, okay, let me do the chemical analysis on this to give me an idea of what these people actually had to work with, but doing it with modern media, which is probably in some ways kind of a frivolous way to shift off from doing legitimate historical research. But in some ways, I think it's more interesting, and it seems to be a pretty wide open field that doesn't have too much going on with it right now. So uncovering some stuff that I didn't expect to find.
Yeah, speaking of assumptions, have you ever seen some of those, or do you remember those old videos where you hear, in the future, this is what's going to happen? That's a line sort of like in a world of,
Yeah.
in the future, in the far distant future of 1985, people will be flying around. When you look at especially science fiction, do you sense what I do, that oftentimes the ideas of the future are things that just a small fraction of people who are doing the writing of these future stories think is going to be relevant, and they miss the big picture. The obvious one that comes to me is we don't have Jetsons flying cars, and the Jetsons didn't have the internet. But if you think about it, we're a bunch of navel-gazing primates. Of course, we're going to want to know everything about Khloe Kardashian or whoever it
Uh,
is. Not me personally, but the people at large. And do we really need flying cars? Wouldn't that just because if we're adding another dimension, isn't that going to be more accidents kind of thing? We don't want self-driving cars because the Chinese could cause a big crash up on LA, on the LA freeways. Imagine if they were able to do it 100 feet high,
yeah.
So what do you think about some of the sci-fi stuff in some of these works and other things and the predictions and how god-awful they seem to be in predicting the future?
Yeah, I find it interesting. And I mean, of course, I want to preface this with like sometimes writers actually are trying to predict the future, and those are the ones that are most abysmally wrong.
Yeah.
Like usually they're just talking about something in their own time and trying to extrapolate something from a literary standpoint rather than like, I genuinely believe this is what's going to happen. But I kind of think about like the first few chapters of Foundation written in 1948, if I'm remembering right.
Yeah, psychohistory.
Where, yeah, and where they get there to setting up the first foundation, and he's kind of Asimov's describing some of the scenes here, and people are using coinage and they're buying newspapers with them, and it's just like it seems so quaint and outdated now, but it's at the same time anybody reading it now and criticizing it is kind of ridiculous because it was written in the 40s, man, relax. But like the deeper layer of it, I think, is that a lot of prediction, and not just when people in science fiction are trying to actually predict a future, but it's everything, demographic modeling and climate modeling, economic modeling, all of it is based on these linear models, which we do really well. As a species, we're extremely good at looking at one thing, looking at the thing after it, and then guessing what thing number 3 is. And our social structures are kind of built up for that. So now our government agencies and think tanks are exceptionally good at projecting in a linear fashion from limited data points. But the world doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
It's a complex dynamic system with feedback loops, and our institutions are terrible at modeling that stuff. So it's really no surprise to me that science fiction that actually attempts to predict what the future is going to look like ends up being just woefully, often comically wrong, because we're just not conditioned to think that way, and to some degree we really can't be, because part of it is just unexpected shifts and things. Dynamic systems are very difficult to model. That's why we're so bad at it.
A couple more points and then we'll end this. You'd mentioned that you're going to be working on a graphic novel, and I briefly talked about comic books and whatnot. I mentioned the comic book Watchmen, and I've always found it curious as to why that is so highly regarded, because I'm assuming you certainly probably read it. The bad guy, what's his name?
Ozymandias.
Yeah. It's so obvious from the beginning. I remember there was the scene where the guy has a heart attack, and as portrayed, I thought, oh, he was slipped the poison by this Ozymandias, and it's like,
yeah.
a lot of the stuff. I mean, I'm not saying it's bad, but when I see the Watchmen on the top 100 novels of the 20th century, there's something fucking wrong. Because number one, and I have respect for people who do the visual work or whatnot, but literature doesn't need pictures. Literature forms the pictures in the mind. With this, and this is my bias maybe as a writer, but I will argue to the death that literature is the highest form of art that we currently have, shy of us able to telepathically implant ideas into someone's mind, because all you do is have little squiggles on a medium and a world opens up. Your Ahab is different than my Ahab. My Gilgamesh is different than your Gilgamesh, etc. We are co-creating. I would never want to even go in a holodeck, because I want my Ahab. I want my Gilgamesh. So what is your take about Watchmen and what I just mentioned?
I think I'll kind of work back to Watchmen. That the medium really kind of should be dictated by what it is that the writer is trying to do. Like I've written this massive science fiction novel that I've been shopping around for a couple of years now. Haven't had a whole lot of luck with it. And maybe it's because it's not as good as I think it is, but maybe because it's long and weird. I would never want to do that in a graphic novel format. I wouldn't want to try to make a movie out of it. It just would not work. It has to be a book. It's got to be prose, or you'll lose so much bandwidth trying to do it otherwise. Whereas this graphic novel I want to do, it's based on this historical research, and what I'm trying to do is take all of this information and condense it in a way that somebody who isn't a historian, isn't particularly interested in the end of World War II and the early stages of the Cold War, can pick up, be entertained by it, and also learn something and kind of realize, oh, wow, I didn't realize how messed up this whole thing was, and how many Nazis were brought over into prominent positions running agencies within the United States government. Wow, this changed my thinking, without having to read this gigantic dissertation. Now, in the case of Watchmen, what I like overall, I like Watchmen. I came to it actually after the Zack Snyder film. I was aware of Watchmen, but I hadn't read it until after the movie was out. But one of the elements I like about it is, and I think if I didn't know that Ozymandias was the bad guy before the big reveal, I wouldn't have liked it as much. I appreciated that he gave just enough in there that you could kind of tease it out long before they come out and tell you, because I like that idea of, the big larger than life hero, and I'm kind of, turning into a villain, because I was thinking of it in terms of it's sort of representative of like collectivist government systems and things, where it's like, this will save us. No, this actually just thinks you're a pawn, and it doesn't care about you at all beyond what it can use you for to achieve its own ends. And so with that aspect of it, I really appreciate what Alan Moore did with Watchmen.
But let me ask you, did you not, so you didn't see Ozymandias as the villain? For me, given that it was Alan Moore, given that he's a walking, talking corporation by that point, and given the fact that I believe you had mentioned child slave labor or something, I believe he's cranking out Ozymandias, what they now call merch, from India or something. He had to be the bad guy.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing. Once they that first scene where he's in his boardroom there and he's talking, it's like, oh, this is a bad guy, isn't he? But they gave you enough that you could, if you're actually paying attention, okay, you got it. But it isn't, they didn't do that thing where right up front it's like, this is the bad guy, which I think that's part of why I like it, because there are so many people in, like this country, for example, and I'm sure this is true in pretty much every other country, where you can look at whether it's your preferred politician, your preferred political party, the government itself, that element of, well, I'm told this is the good guy. They're here to help, They're the party of the working man, or they're defending us from terrorists, or whatever it is. And if you're not really looking at what's actually happened, you just accept it until it bites you in the ass. And that's kind of the framework that I was looking at Ozymandias through, is and it's sure that's in my own warped little head. I seriously doubt Alan Moore actually intended that. But I thought it was interesting from that standpoint.
Well, also, I didn't read the book until I guess I was in my 40s, because people were telling me I should read it. You probably read it more as a teenager or whenever.
No, I didn't actually read Watchmen until my early 30s, I think.
Okay. Yeah, and it's not that I slag on comic books, because I remember when they did the death of the reign of the Superman after they killed off Superman 30 years ago. There was one comic. They made Hal Jordan, the Green Lantern, a villain after, I think it was the character Mongol kills Coast City, wipes Coast City, which I guess San Francisco off the map. And there's a scene of Coast City, and things seem to have been restored. And then it turns out the final panel, all you do is see a dejected Hal Jordan has remade the city with his ring. And that's the kind of thing that is better to leave for the visuals. It had an impact that just the writing couldn't. And which
Yeah.
reminds me, if you want to comment on that, but also too, do you think sci-fi is better in a visual medium? Because I think genre writing, horror and science fiction come to mind as the two genres most likely. Whether you're watching the Discovery 10 2001 ship, or you're watching the Star Wars ship going slowly, 1,000 words isn't going to describe that necessarily.
Yeah, it really depends on what you're trying to do. I think it's I have seen sometimes, like, I guess the example I'll use now is Dune. That now we have 3 iterations, attempts to translate this to film to look at, in comparison, and the films are terrible at getting across things that are going on in characters' heads. It's when they manage to get it across, it's really clumsy with voiceovers recorded over the background of things in strange voices, or just you omit it entirely. So there's a lot of depth in the book that just doesn't make it into any of those translations. But in the book, trying to read Frank Herbert's description of an ornithopter, it's like, what are you talking about? This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But in that latest Dune film, it's like, oh, there. You can just show somebody a clip of this flying dragonfly helicopter thing, and it's just like, okay, I get it, much clearer than you could ever describe. So it's kind of, the medium really limits you in different ways depending on what you pick. So you always have to compromise. What's most important to get across? And I think that might be why I do appreciate adaptations of things, even when they're not done well, because then you get to do this multi-layered where each medium's strengths, if it's done well, can get across the things that they're trying to. When in any one, you're going to lose something.
Well, we spent quite a bit of time talking. It was a good conversation. I will link to Feral Historian, the YouTube channel below. It was really a pleasure speaking with you, Matt. I would encourage people to go there and check it out. I'll link below the video. And so thanks again for talking with me.
Yeah, will do. Take care.